He spotted the huge temple against the steep cliff approximately a half-kilometer, a third of a mile, distant. One tiny figure sat at the top of the long stairway, hunched over with his back against a wide archway. There was no doubt in Pitt's mind this was where the terrorists had taken their hostages. The narrow pass was the only way in and out of the steep-walled valley. The fear and anxiety that he might stumble across the bodies of Giordino and the archaeologists were swept away in a wave of relief. The hunt was ended. Now the quarry, who did not yet know they were quarry, had to be quietly cancelled out one by one until the odds became manageable. He moved in closer, using the fallen walls of old residential homes around the temple as cover. He crouched and ran soundlessly from one shelter to the next until he crawled behind a large stone figure displaying a phallic design. He paused and stared up at the entrance to the temple. The long stairway leading to the entrance presented a formidable obstacle. Unless he somehow possessed the power of invisibility, Pitt would be shot down before he was a quarter of the way up the steps. Any attempt in broad daylight was suicidal. No way in, he thought bitterly. Flanking the staircase was out of the question. The temple's side walls were too sheer and too smooth. The stones were laid with such precision a knife blade could not fit between the cracks. Then Providence laid a benevolent hand on his shoulder. The problem of creeping up the stairs unseen was erased when Pitt observed that the terrorist who was guarding the entrance to the temple had fallen hard asleep from the effects of the exhausting march through the jungle mountains. Inhaling and exhaling a deep breath, Pitt stealthily crept toward the stairway. Tupac Amaru was a smooth but dangerous character, and he looked it. Having taken the name of the last king of the Incas to be tortured and killed by the Spanish, he was short, narrow-shouldered, with a vacant brown face devoid of expression. He looked as though he never learned how to express the least hint of compassion. Unlike most of the hill country people whose broad faces were smooth and hairless, Amaru wore a huge mustache and long sideburns that stretched from a thick mass of straight hair that was as black as his empty eyes. When the narrow, bloodless lips arched in a slight smile, which was rare, they revealed a set of teeth that would make an orthodontist proud. His men, conversely, often grinned diabolically through jagged and uneven coca-stained bicuspids. Amaru had cut a swath of death and destruction throughout the jungle hill country of Amazonas, a department in northeastern Peru that had more than its share of poverty, terrorism, sickness, and bureaucratic corruption. His band of cutthroats was responsible for the disappearance of several explorers, government archaeologists, and army patrols that had entered the region and were never seen again. He was not the revolutionary he seemed. Amaru couldn't have cared less about revolution or improving the lot of the abysmally poor Indians of the Peruvian hinterlands, most of whom worked tiny plots to eke out a bare existence. Amaru had other reasons for controlling the region and keeping the superstitious natives under his domination. He stood in the doorway of the chamber, staring stonily at the 3 men and 1 woman before him as if for the first time, relishing the defeat in their eyes, the weariness in their bodies, exactly the state in which he wanted them. "I regret the inconvenience," he said, speaking for the first time since the abduction. "It is good that you offered no resistance, or you would have surely been shot." "You speak pretty good English for a Highlands guerrilla," Rogers acknowledged. "Mr. Tupac Amaru. I attended the University of Texas at Austin." "What hath Texas wrought?" Giordino mumbled under his breath. "Why have you kidnapped us?" Shannon whispered in a voice hushed with fear and fatigue. "For ransom, what else?" replied Amaru. "The Peruvian government will pay well for the return of such respected American scientists, not to mention their brilliant archaeology students, many of whom have rich and respected parents. The money will help us continue our fight against repression of the masses." "Spoken like a communist milking a dead cow," muttered Giordino. "The old Russian version may well be history, but the philosophy of Mao Zedong lives on," Amaru explained patiently. "It lives on, all right," Doc Miller sneered. "Billions of dollars in economic damage. 26,000 Peruvians dead, most of the victims the very peasants whose rights you claim to be fighting for." His words were cut off by a rifle butt that was jammed into his lower back near the kidney. Miller sagged to the stone floor like a bag of potatoes, his face twisted in pain. "You're hardly in a position to question my dedication to the cause," Amaru said coldly. Giordino knelt beside the old man and cradled his head. He looked up at the terrorist leader with scorn. "You don't take criticism very well, do you?" Giordino was prepared to ward off a blow to his exposed head, but before the guard could raise his rifle butt again, Shannon stepped between them. She glared at Amaru, the pale fear in her face replaced with red anger. "You're a fraud," Shannon stated firmly. Amaru looked at her with a bemused expression. "And what brings you to that curious conclusion, Dr. Kelsey?" "You know my name?" "My agent in the United States alerted me of your latest project to explore the mountains before you and your friends left the airport in Phoenix, Arizona." "Informant, you mean?" Amaru shrugged. "Semantics mean little." "A fraud and a charlatan," Shannon continued. "You and your men aren't Shining Path revolutionaries. Far from it. You're nothing more than vaqueros, thieving tomb robbers." "She's right," Rogers said, backing her up. "You wouldn't have time to chase around the countryside blowing up power lines and police stations and still accumulate the vast cache of artifacts inside this temple. It's obvious. You're running an elaborate artifact theft ring that has to be a full-time operation." Amaru looked at his prisoners in mocking speculation. "Since the fact must be patently apparent to everyone in the room, I won't bother to deny it." A few seconds passed in silence, then Doc Miller rose unsteadily to his feet and stared Amaru directly in the eye. "You thieving scum," he rasped. "Pillager, ravager of antiquities. If it was in my power, I'd have you and your band of looters shot down like—" Miller broke off suddenly as Amaru, his features utterly lacking the least display of emotion and his black eyes venting evil, removed a Heckler & Koch 9mm automatic from a hip holster. With the paralyzing inevitability of a dream, he calmly, precisely, shot Doc Miller in the chest. The reverberating blast echoed through the temple, deafening all ears. One shot was all that was required. Doc Miller jerked backward against the stone wall for one shocking moment, and then dropped forward onto his stomach without a sound. Hands and arms twisted oddly beneath his chest as a pool of red oozed across the floor. The captives all reflected different reactions. Rogers stood like a statue frozen in time, eyes wide with shock and disbelief, while Shannon instinctively screamed. No stranger to violent death, Giordino clenched his hands at his sides. The ice-cold indifference of the murderous act filled him with a savage rage that was tempered only by maddening helplessness. There was no doubt in his mind, in anybody's mind, that Amaru intended to kill them all. With nothing to lose, Giordino tensed to leap at the killer and tear out his throat before he received the inevitable bullet through the head. "Do not try it," said Amaru, reading Giordino's thoughts, aiming the muzzle of the automatic between the eyes that burned with hate. He inclined his head toward the guards, who stood with guns level and ready, and gave them orders in Spanish. Then he stepped aside as one of the guards grabbed Miller around the ankles and dragged his body out of sight into the main room of the temple, leaving a trail of blood across the stone floor. Shannon's scream had given way to uncontrollable sobbing as she stared with bleak, unwavering eyes at the bloody streak on the floor. She sagged to her knees in shock and buried her face in her hands. "He couldn't harm you. How could you shoot down a kindly old man?" Giordino stared at Amaru. For him it was easy. Amaru's flat, cold eyes crawled to Giordino's face. "You would do well to keep your mouth closed, little man. The good doctor was supposed to be a lesson that apparently you did not comprehend." No one took notice of the return of the guard who had dragged away Miller's body. No one except Giordino. He caught the hat pulled down over the eyes, the hands concealed within the poncho. He flicked a glance at the second guard who slouched casually against the doorway, his gun now slung loosely over one shoulder, the muzzle pointing at no one in particular. Only 2 meters separated them. Giordino figured he could be all over the guard before he knew what hit him. But there was still the heckler and cock tightly gripped in Amaru's hand. When Giordino spoke, his voice wore a cold edge. "You are going to die, Amaru. You are surely going to die as violently as all the innocent people you've murdered in cold blood." Amaru didn't catch the millimetric curl of Giordino's lips, the slight squint of the eyes. His expression turned curious, then the teeth flashed and he laughed. "So, you think I'm going to die, do you? Will you be my executioner? Or will the proud young lady do me the honor?" He leaned down and savagely jerked Shannon to her feet, took hold of her flowing ponytail, and viciously pulled her head backward until she was staring from wide, terrified eyes into his leering face. "I promise that after a few hours in my bed you'll crawl to obey my commands." "Oh, God, no," Shannon moaned. "I take great pleasure in raping women, listening as they scream and beg." A brawny arm tightened around his throat and choked off his words. "This is for all the women you made suffer," said Pitt, a macabre look in his intense green eyes, as he cast aside the poncho, jammed the barrel of the .45 Colt down the front of Amaru's pants, and pulled the trigger.
This book is continued on Disc 3. Disc 3.
Chapter 6. For the second time the small confines of the room echoed with the deafening sound of gunfire. Giordino hurled himself forward, his head and shoulder driving into the startled guard, crushing him against the hard wall, causing an explosive gasp of pain. He caught the distorted look of horror and agony on Amaru's face, the bulging eyes, his mouth open in a silent scream, a fleeting glimpse of the heckler and cock flying through the air as his hands clutched the mushrooming red stain in his groin. And then Giordino punched the guard in the teeth and tore the automatic rifle from his hands in almost the same movement. He swung around in a crouched firing position, muzzle aimed through the doorway. This time Shannon didn't scream. Instead, she crawled into a corner of the room and sat motionless, like a waxen effigy of herself, staring dumbly at Amaru's blood splattered over her bare arms and legs. If she had been terrified earlier, she was now merely numb with shock. Then she stared up at Pitt, lips taut, face pale, specks of blood in her blonde hair. Rogers was staring at Pitt, too, with an expression of astonishment. Somehow he knew, recognized the eyes, the animal-like movements. "You're the diver from the cave," he said dazedly. Pitt nodded. "One and the same." "You're supposed to be back in the well," Shannon murmured in a trembling voice. "Sir Edmund Hillary has nothing on me." Pitt grinned slyly. "I scramble up and down the walls of sinkholes like a human fly." He shoved a horrified Amaru to the floor as if the terrorist were a drunk on a sidewalk and placed a hand on Giordino's shoulder. "You can relax, Al. The other guards have seen the light of decency and virtue." Giordino, with a smile as wide as an open drawbridge, laid aside the automatic rifle and embraced Pitt. "God, I never thought I'd see your gargoyle face again. The things you put me through. A damn shame.
I can't go away for half an hour without you involving me in a local crime wave." "Why the delay?" asked Giordino, not to be outdone. "We expected you hours ago." "I missed my bus. Which reminds me, where is my Dixieland band?" "They don't play sinkholes." "Seriously, how in hell did you climb a sheer wall and trail us through the jungle?" "Not exactly a fun-filled feat, believe me. I'll tell you over a beer another time. And the guards, what happened to the other 4 guards? Pitt gave a negligent shrug. "Their attention wandered, and they all met with unfortunate accidents, mostly concussions or possible skull fractures." Then his face turned grim. "I ran into one pulling Doc Miller's body through the main entrance. Who carried out the execution?" Giordino nodded at Amaru. "Our friend here shot him in the heart for no good reason. He's also the guy who dropped the safety line down around your head." "Then I won't bother myself with remorse," Pitt said, staring down at Amaru, who was clutching his groin and moaning in agony, fearful of looking to ascertain the damage. "Kind of makes me warm all over knowing that his sex life just went dysfunctional. Does he have a name?" "Calls himself Tupac Amaru," answered Shannon. "The name of the last Inca king. Probably took it to impress the hill people." "The Peruvian students," Giordino said, remembering. "They were herded down a stairway underneath the temple." "I've already released them. Brave kids. By now they should have the guerrillas tied up and neatly packaged until the government authorities arrive."
Not guerrillas, and hardly dedicated revolutionaries.
More like professional artifact looters masquerading as Shining Path terrorists. They pillage precious antiquities to sell through international underground markets. "Amaru is only the base of a totem pole," added Rogers. "His clients are the distributors who make the bulk of the profits." "They have good taste," observed Pitt. "From what I glimpsed, there must be enough prime merchandise stashed here to satisfy half the museums and private collectors in the world." Shannon hesitated a moment, then stepped up to Pitt, put her hands around his neck, pulled his head down, and kissed him lightly on the lips. "You saved our lives. Thank you." "Not once, but twice," Rogers added, pumping Pitt's hand while Shannon still clung to him. "A lot of luck was involved," Pitt said with uncharacteristic embarrassment. Despite the damp, stringy hair, the lack of makeup, the dirty and torn blouse over the black swimsuit, and the incongruous hiking boots, he still saw a sensual lustiness about her. "Thank God you got here when you did," said Shannon with a shiver. "I deeply regret I was too late to save Doc Miller." "Where have they taken him?" asked Rogers. "I stopped the scum who was disposing of the body just outside the temple entrance. Doc is lying on the landing above the steps." Giordino gazed at Pitt, inspecting him from head to toe, observing the multitude of cuts and scratches on his friend's face and arms from his race through the jungle in the dark, seeing a man who was all but dead on his feet. "You look like you just finished a triathlon and then fell on a roll of barbed wire. As your resident medicine man, I recommend a few hours' rest before we hike back to the sinkhole campsite." "I look worse than I feel," Pitt said cheerfully. "Time enough for a snooze later. First things first. Me, I don't have the slightest inclination to play Tarzan again. I'm taking the next flight out of here." "Madness," muttered Giordino half in jest. "A few hours in the jungle and he goes flaky." "Do you really think we can fly out of here?" inquired Shannon skeptically. "Absolutely," Pitt said. "In fact, I guarantee it." Rogers stared at him. "Only a helicopter could come in and out of the valley." Pitt grinned. "I wouldn't have it any other way. How else do you think Amaru, or whatever his name is, transports his stolen goods to a coastal port for shipment out of the country? That calls for a communication system, So there must be a radio around we can appropriate to send out a call for help. Giordino gave an approving nod. Makes sense, providing we can find it. A portable radio could be hidden anywhere in one of the surrounding ruins. We could spend days looking for it. Pitt stared down at Amaru, his face expressionless. He knows where it is. Amaru fought off the pain and stared back at Pitt with black, malignant eyes. "We have no radio," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Forgive me if I don't take you at your word. Where do you keep it?" "I will tell you nothing." Amaru's mouth twisted as he spoke. "Would you rather die?" Pitt queried dryly. "You would do me a service by killing me." Pitt's green eyes were as cold as a lake above timberline. "How many women have you raped and murdered?" Amaru's expression was contemptuous. "So numerous I've lost count." "You want me to fly into a rage and blow you away, is that it?" "Why don't you ask how many children I've slaughtered?" "You're only kidding yourself." Pitt took the Colt .45 and placed the muzzle against the side of Amaru's face. "Kill you?" "I fail to see the percentage in that. One shot through both eyes would be more appropriate. You'll still live, but along with your other recent impairment, you'll also be blind." Amaru put on a show of arrogance, but there was unmistakable fear in his dead eyes, and there was a noticeable trembling of his lips. "You're bluffing." "After the eyes, then the kneecaps," Pitt described conversationally. "Perhaps the ears next, or better yet, the nose. If I were you, I'd quit while I was ahead." Seeing that Pitt was stone-cold serious and realizing he was at a dead end, Amaru caved in. "You'll find what you're looking for inside a round building 50 meters west of the temple. There is a monkey carved above the doorway." Pitt turned to Giordino. "Take one of the students with you to translate. Contact the nearest Peruvian authorities. Give our location and report our situation. Then request they send in an army unit. There may be more of these characters lurking in the ruins." Giordino looked thoughtfully at Amaru. "If I send a mayday over an open frequency, this homicidal maniac's pals in Lima might very well pick it up and send in a force of goons instead of the army." "Trusting the army can be touch and go," added Shannon. "One or more of their high-ranking officers could be in on this." "Graft," Pitt stated philosophically, "makes the world go round." Rogers nodded. "Shannon's right. This is tomb robbery on a grand scale. The profits could easily match the take of any top drug smuggling operation. Whoever the mastermind is, he couldn't conduct business without paying off government officials." "We can use our own frequency and contact Juan," suggested Shannon. "Juan?" "Juan Chaco, the Peruvian government coordinator for our project. He's in charge of our supply headquarters at the nearest city." "Can he be trusted?" "I believe so," Shannon replied without hesitation. "Juan is one of the most respected archaeologists in South America, and a leading scholar on Andean cultures. He's also the government watchdog on illegal diggings and smuggling of antiquities." "Sounds like our man," Pitt said to Giordino. "Find the radio, call him up, and ask for a chopper to airlift us the hell back to our ship." "I'll go with you and notify Juan of Doc's murder," offered Shannon. "I'd also like a closer look at the structures around the temple." "Take along weapons and keep a sharp eye," Pitt warned them. "What about Doc's body?" asked Rogers. "We can't leave him lying around like a roadkill." "I agree," said Pitt. "Bring him inside the temple out of the sun and wrap him in some blankets until he can be airlifted to the nearest coroner." "Leave him to me," Rogers said angrily. "It's the least I can do for a good man." Amaru grinned hideously, actually grinned through his agony. "Fools! Crazy fools!" he sneered. You'll never leave the Pueblo de los Muertos alive." "Pueblo de los Muertos means City of the Dead," Shannon translated. The others glanced in disgust at Amaru. To them he seemed like an impotent rattlesnake, too injured to coil and strike. But Pitt still saw him as dangerous, and was not about to make the fatal mistake of underestimating him. He didn't care for the eerie expression of confidence in Amaru's eyes. As soon as the others hurried out of the room, Pitt knelt beside Amaru. "You act pretty sure of yourself for a man in your position." "The last laugh will be mine." Amaru's face contorted in a sudden spasm of pain. "You have blundered into the path of powerful men. Their wrath will be terrible." Pitt smiled indifferently. "I've blundered up against powerful men before. By lifting a tiny piece of the curtain, you have endangered the Solpe Machaco. They will do whatever necessary to prevent exposure, even if it means the elimination of an entire province." "Not exactly a sweet-tempered group you're associated with. What do you call them again?" Amaru went silent. He was becoming weak from shock and the loss of blood. Slowly, with much difficulty, he lifted a hand and pointed a finger at Pitt. "You are cursed. Your bones will rest with the Chachapoyas forever." Then his eyes went unfocused, closed, and he fainted. Pitt stared at Shannon. "Who are the Chachapoyas?" "Known as the Cloud People," Shannon explained. "They were a pre-Inca culture that flourished high in the Andes from AD 800 to 1480, when they were conquered by the Incas. It was the Chachapoyas who built this elaborate necropolis for the dead." Pitt rose to his feet, removed the guard's felt hat from his head, and dropped it on Amaru's chest. He turned and walked into the main chamber of the temple and spent the next few minutes examining the incredible cache of Chachapoyan artifacts. He was admiring a large clay mummy case when Rogers rushed up, looking disturbed. "Where did you say you left Doc Miller?" Rogers asked, half out of breath. "On the landing above the exterior steps." "You'd better show me." Pitt followed Rogers outside the arched entrance. He stopped and stared down at a bloodstain on the stone landing, then looked up questioningly. "Who moved the body?" "If you don't know," said an equally mystified Rogers, "I certainly don't." "Did you look around the base of the temple? Maybe he fell." "I sent 4 of the archaeology students down to search. They found no sign of the doc." "Could any of the students have moved him?" "I checked. They're all as bewildered as we are." "Dead bodies do not get up and walk off," said Pitt flatly. Rogers looked around the outside of the temple, then gave a shrug. "It looks as if this one did." Chapter 7. The air conditioner whirred and circulated cool, dry air inside the long motor home that served as the archaeology project's headquarters in Chachapoya. And the man reclining on a leather sofa was a great deal less fatigued than the men and women in the City of the Dead. Juan Chaco rested languidly while maintaining a firm grip on his well-iced gin and tonic. But he sat up in full wakefulness almost instantly when a voice came over the radio speaker mounted on a wall behind the driver's compartment. "St. John calling St. Peter." The voice came sharp and distinct. "St. John calling St. Peter. Are you there?" Chaco moved quickly across the interior of the plush motorhome and pressed the transmit button on the radio. "I am here and listening." "Turn on the recorder. I don't have time to repeat myself or explain the situation in detail." Chaco acknowledged and switched on a cassette recorder. "Ready to receive." Amaru and his followers were overpowered and taken prisoner. They are now being held under guard by the archaeologists. Amaru was shot and may be badly wounded." Chaco's face suddenly turned grim. "How is this possible?" "One of the men from Numa who responded to your distress call somehow escaped from the sinkhole and pursued Amaru and his captives to the Valley Temple, where he managed to subdue our overpaid cutthroats one by one." "What sort of devil could do all this?" "A very dangerous and resourceful devil." "Are you safe?" "For the moment." "Then our plan to frighten the archaeologists from our collection grounds has failed." "Miserably," replied the caller. "Once Dr. Kelsey saw the artifacts awaiting shipment, she guessed the setup." "What of Miller?" "They suspect nothing." "At least something went right," said Chaco. "If you send in a force before they leave the valley," explained the familiar voice, "we can still salvage the operation." "It was not our intention to harm our Peruvian students," said Chaco. "The repercussions for my countrymen would spell the end to any further business between us." "Too late, my friend. Now that they realize their ordeal was caused by a looting syndicate instead of Shining Path terrorists, they can't be allowed to reveal what they've seen. We have no choice but to eliminate them. None of this would have occurred if you had prevented Dr. Kelsey and Miles Rogers from diving in the sacred well. Short of committing murder in front of the students, there was no stopping them. Sending out the rescue call was a mistake. Not if we wish to avoid serious inquiry by your government officials. Their drownings would have appeared suspicious if the correct rescue measures hadn't been taken. We cannot afford to expose the Solpe Machaco to public scrutiny. Besides, how could we know that Numa would respond from out of nowhere? True, an event that was inconceivable at the time. As Chaco spoke, his empty eyes gazed at a small stone statue of a winged jaguar that was dug up in the Valley of the Dead. Finally, he said quietly, "I'll arrange for our hired mercenaries from the Peruvian army to drop in the Pueblo de los Muertos by helicopter within 2 hours." "Do you have confidence in the commanding officer to do the job?" Chaco smiled to himself. "If I can't trust my own brother, who can I trust?" I never believed in resurrection of mere mortals. Pitt stood gazing down at the pool of crimson on the landing above the near-vertical stairway leading to the floor of the valley. "But this is as good an example as I've ever seen." "He was dead," Rogers said emphatically. "I was standing as close to him as I am to you when Amaru put a bullet through his heart. Blood was everywhere. You saw him lying here. There can be no doubt in your mind Doc was a corpse." "I didn't take the time to do a post-mortem examination." "Okay, but how do you explain the trail of blood from the interior chamber where Doc was shot? There must be a gallon of it spread from here to there." "Closer to a pint," said Pitt thoughtfully. "You exaggerate." "How long would you guess the body rested here from the time you knocked out the guard and then released the students who arrived and tied him up?" asked Rogers. 4, maybe 5 minutes at the outside. "And within that time a 67-year-old dead man bounds down 200 tiny, narrow, niched steps laid on a 75-degree angle. Steps that can't be taken more than one at a time without falling, and then he vanishes without shedding another drop of blood." Rogers shook his head. "Houdini would have flushed with envy." "Are you sure it was Doc Miller?" Pitt asked pensively. "Of course it was Doc," Rogers said incredulously. "Who else do you think it was?" "How long have you known him?" "By reputation, at least 15 years. Personally, I only met him 5 days ago." Rogers stared at Pitt as if he were a madman. "Look, you're fishing in empty waters. Doc is one of the world's leading anthropologists. He is to ancient American culture what Leakey is to African prehistory. His face has graced 100 articles in dozens of magazines from the Smithsonian to the National Geographic. He has narrated and appeared in any number of public service television documentaries on early man. Doc was no recluse. He loved publicity. He was easily recognizable. "Just fishing," Pitt said in a patient, explaining tone. "Nothing like a wild plot to stir the mind." He broke off as Shannon and Giordino sprinted into view around the circular base of the temple. Even at this height above the ground, he could see they appeared agitated. He waited until Giordino was halfway up the stairs before he shouted, "Don't tell me somebody beat you to the radio and smashed it." Giordino paused, leaning against the sheer stairway. "Wrong," he shouted back. "It was gone. Snatched by person or persons unknown." By the time Shannon and Giordino reached the top of the stairs, they were both panting from the exertion and glistening with sweat. Shannon daintily patted her face with a soft tissue all women seem to produce at the most crucial times. Giordino merely rubbed an already damp sleeve across his forehead. "Whoever built this thing," he said between breaths, "should have installed an elevator." "Did you find the tomb with the radio?" Pitt asked. Giordino nodded. "We found it all right. No cheapskates, these guys. The tomb was furnished right out of Abercrombie and Fitch. The best outdoor paraphernalia money can buy. There was even a portable generator providing power to a refrigerator." "Empty," Pitt guessed. Giordino nodded. "The rat who made off with the radio took the time to smash nearly 4 six-packs of perfectly good Coors beer." "Coors in Peru?" Rogers asked dubiously. "I can show you the labels on the broken bottles," moaned Giordino. "Someone wanted us to go thirsty." "No fear of that with a jungle just beyond the pass," Pitt said with a slight smile. Giordino stared at Pitt, but there was no return smile. "So how do we call in the Marines?" Pitt shrugged. "With the tomb robber's radio missing, and the 1-hour helicopter looking like a lump of Swiss cheese." He broke off and turned to Rogers. "What about your communications at the sinkhole site?" The photographer shook his head. "One of Amaru's men shot our radio to junk the same as yours." "Don't tell me," Shannon said resignedly. "We have to trudge 30 kilometers back through the forest primeval to the project site at the sinkhole, and then another 90 kilometers to Chacha." "Maybe Chaco will become worried when he realizes all contact is lost with the project and send in a search party to investigate," Rogers said hopefully. "Even if they traced us to the city of the dead," Pitt said slowly, "they'd arrive too late. All they'd find would be dead bodies scattered around the ruins." Everyone glanced at him in puzzled curiosity. "Amaru claimed we have upset the apple cart of powerful men," Pitt continued by way of explanation, "and that they would never allow us to leave this valley alive for fear that we would expose their artifact theft operation." "But if they intended to kill us," Shannon said uncertainly, "why bring us here? They could have just as well shot everyone and thrown our remains into the sinkhole." "In order for them to make it look like a Shining Path raid, they may have had it in their mind to play the hostage for ransom game. If the Peruvian government, your university officials in the States, or the families of the archaeological students had paid enormous sums for your release, all the better. They'd have simply considered the ransom money as a bonus to the profits of their illegal smuggling and murdered all of you anyway." "Who are these people?" Shannon asked sharply. "Amaru referred to them as the Solpe Machaco, whatever that translates into." "Solpe Machaco," Shannon echoed. "A combination Medusa-dragon myth from the local ancients. Folklore passed down through the centuries describes Solpe Machaco as an evil serpent with 7 heads who lives in a cave. One myth claims he lives here in the Pueblo de los Muertos." Giordino yawned indifferently. "Sounds like a bad screenplay starring another monster from the bowels of the earth." "More likely a clever play on words," said Pitt. "A metaphor as a code name for an international looting organization with a vast reach into the underground antiquities market." The serpent's 7 heads could represent the masterminds behind the organization, suggested Shannon. Or 7 different bases of operation, added Rogers. Now that we've cleared up that mystery, Giordino said wryly, why don't we clear the hell out of here and head for the sinkhole before the Sioux and Cheyenne come charging through the pass? Because they'd be waiting when we got there, said Pitt. Methinks we should stay put. You really believe they'll send men to kill us? Shannon said, her expression more angry than fearful. Pitt nodded. I'd bet my pension on it. Whoever made off with the radio most certainly tattled on us. I judge his pals will soar into the valley like maddened hornets in... He paused to glance at his watch before continuing. About an hour and a half. After that, they'll shoot down anyone who vaguely resembles an archaeologist. Not what I call a cheery thought, she murmured. With 6 automatic rifles and Dirk's handgun, I reckon we might discourage a first-rate gang of 24 cutthroats for all of 10 minutes, muttered Giordino gloomily. We can't stay here and fight armed criminals, Rogers protested. We'd all be slaughtered. And there are the lives of those kids to consider, said Shannon, suddenly looking a little pale. Before we're swept up in an orgy of pessimism, said Pitt briskly, as if he hadn't a care in the world, I suggest we round up everyone and evacuate the temple. Then what? Demanded Rogers. First, we look around for Amaru's landing site. For what purpose? Giordino rolled his eyes. I know that look. He's hatching another Machiavellian scheme. Nothing too contrived, Pitt said patiently. I figure that after the Bushes land and begin chasing around the ruins searching for us, we'll borrow their helicopter and fly off to the nearest 4-star hotel and a refreshing bath. There was a moment of incredulous stillness. They all stared at Pitt as if he'd just stepped out of a Martian space capsule. Giordino was the first to break the stunned silence. See? He said with a wide grin. I told you so. Chapter 8. Pitt's estimate of an hour and a half was shy by only 10 minutes. The stillness of the valley was broken by the throb of rotor blades whipping the air, as 2 Peruvian military helicopters flew over the crest of a saddle between mountain peaks and circled the ancient buildings. After a cursory reconnaissance of the area, they descended in a clearing amid the ruins less than 100 meters, 328 feet, from the front of the conical temple structure. The troops spilled out rapidly through the rear clamshell doors, under the beating rotor blades, and lined up at rigid attention as though they were standing for inspection. These were no ordinary soldiers dedicated to preserving the peace of their nation. They were mercenary misfits who hired themselves out to the highest bidder. At the direction of the officer in charge, a captain incongruously attired in full-dress uniform, the 2 platoons of 30 men each were formed into one closely packed battle line led by 2 lieutenants. Satisfied the line was straight, the captain raised a swagger stick above his head and motioned for the officers under his command to launch the assault on the temple. Then he climbed a low wall to direct the one-sided battle from what he thought was a safe viewpoint. The captain shouted encouragement to his men, urging them to bravely charge up the steps of the temple. His voice echoed because of the hard acoustics of the ruins. But he broke off and uttered a strange, awking sound that became a fit of gagging pain. For a brief instant he stiffened. His face twisted in incomprehension. Then he folded forward and pitched off the wall, landing with a loud crack on the back of his head. A short, dumpy lieutenant in baggy combat fatigues rushed over and knelt beside the fallen captain, looked up at the funeral palace in dazed understanding, opened his mouth to shout an order, then crumpled over the body beneath him, the sharp crack of a Type 56-1 rifle, the last thing he heard before death swept over him. From the landing on the upper level of the temple, flat on his stomach behind a small barricade of stones, Pitt stared down at the line of confused troops through the sights of the rifle, and fired another 4 rounds into their ranks, picking off the only remaining officer. There was no look of surprise or fear on Pitt's face at seeing the overwhelming mercenary force, only a set look of determination in the deep green eyes. By resisting, he was providing a diversion to save the lives of 13 innocent people. Merely firing over the troops' heads to momentarily slow the assault was a futile waste of time. These men had come to kill all witnesses to a criminal operation. Kill or be killed was a cliché, but it held true. These men would give no quarter. Pitt was not a pitiless man. His eyes were neither steel-hard nor ice-cold. For him there was no enjoyment in killing a complete stranger. His biggest regret was that the faceless men responsible for the crimes were not in his sights. Cautiously he pulled the assault rifle back from the tight peephole between the stones and surveyed the ground below. The Peruvian mercenaries had fanned out behind the stone ruins. A few scattered shots were fired upward at the temple, chipping the stone carvings before ricocheting and whining off into the cliff of tombs behind. These were hardened, disciplined fighting men who recovered quickly under pressure. Killing their officers had stalled, but not stopped them. The sergeants had taken command and were concentrating on a tactic to eliminate this unexpected resistance. Pitt ducked back behind the stone barricade as a torrent of automatic weapons fire peppered the outside columns, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. This came as no surprise to him. The Peruvians were laying down a covering fire as they crouched and dashed from ruin to ruin, moving ever closer to the base of the stairs leading up the rounded front of the temple. Pitt moved sideways like a crab and edged into the shelter of the Death Palace before rising to his feet and running to the rear wall. He cast a wary eye out an arched window. Knowing that the round walls of the temple were too smooth to scale for an attack and too steep for the defenders to escape, none of the soldiers had circled around to the rear. Pitt could easily predict that they were gambling their entire force on a frontal assault up the stairway. What he hadn't foreseen was that they were going to reduce a lot of the Palace of the Dead on top of the temple to rubble before charging up the stairway. Pitt scurried back to the barricade and let loose a long burst from the Chinese automatic rifle until the final shell spit across the stone floor. He rolled to one side and was in the act of inserting another long, curved ammo stick in the gun's magazine when he heard a whoosh, and a 40mm rocket from a People's Republic of China Type 69 launcher sailed up and burst against one side of the temple 8 meters, 26 feet behind Pitt. It detonated with a thunderous explosion that hurled stone like shrapnel and tore a huge hole in the wall. Within seconds, the ancient shrine to the death gods was clogged with debris and the evil stench of high explosives. There was a loud ringing in Pitt's ears, the reverberating roar of the detonation, the pounding of his own heart. He was momentarily blinded, and his nose and throat were immediately filled with dust. He frantically rubbed his eyes clear and gazed down at the surrounding ruins. He was just in time to see the black smoke cloud and bright flash produced by the rocket's booster. He ducked with his hands over his head as another rocket slammed into the ancient stone and exploded with a deafening roar. The vicious blow pelted Pitt with flying rubble, and the concussion knocked the breath out of him. For a moment he lay motionless, almost lifeless. Then he struggled painfully to his hands and knees, coughing dust, seized the rifle, and crawled back into the interior of the palace. He took a last look at the mountain of precious artifacts and paid a final call on Amaru. The grave looter had regained consciousness and glared at Pitt, his hands clutching his groin, now clotted with dried blood, the murderous face masked in hate. There was a strange coldness about him now, an utter indifference to the pain. He radiated evil. "Your friends have a destructive nature," said Pitt, as another rocket struck the temple. "You are trapped," Amaru rasped in a low tone. "Thanks to your staged murder of Dr. Miller's impostor, he made off with your radio and called in reinforcements." "Your time to die has arrived, Yankee pig." "Yankee pig," Pitt repeated. "I haven't been called that in ages." "You will suffer as you have made me suffer." "Sorry, I have other plans." Amaru tried to rise up on an elbow and say something, but Pitt was gone. He rushed to the rear opening again. A mattress and pair of knives he had scrounged from living quarters inside the cliff tomb, discovered by Giordino and Shannon, sat beside the window. He laid the mattress over the lower sill, then lifted his legs outside and sat on it. He cast aside the rifle, gripped the knives in outstretched hands, and glanced apprehensively at the ground 20 meters, 65 feet below. He recalled an occasion when he bungee-jumped into a canyon on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Leaping into space, he mused, went against all human nature. Any hesitation or second thought abruptly ended when a fourth rocket smashed into the temple. He dug the heels of his sneakers into the steep slope and jammed the knife blades into the stone blocks for brakes. Without a backward glance, he launched himself over the side and slid down the wall, using the mattress as a toboggan sled. Giordino, with Shannon and the students trailing behind him and Rogers bringing up the rear, cautiously climbed a stairway from an underground tomb where they had been hiding when the helicopters landed. Giordino paused, raised his head slightly over a fallen stone wall, and scanned the landscape. The helicopters were sitting only 50 meters, 164 feet away, engines idling. The two-man flight crews calmly sitting in their cockpits watching the assault on the temple. Shannon moved beside Giordino and looked over the wall just in time to see a rocket bring down the arched entrance of the upper palace. "They'll destroy the artifacts," she said in grief. "No concern over Dirk?" Giordino spared her a brief glance. "He's only risking his life for us, fighting off an army of mercenaries so we can steal a helicopter." She sighed. "It pains any archaeologist to see precious antiquities lost forever. Better yesterday's junk than us." "I'm sorry. I want him to escape as much as you. But it all seems so impossible." "I've known the guy since we were kids." Giordino smiled. "Believe me, he never passed up an opportunity to play Horatius at the bridge." He studied the two helicopters that sat in the clearing in a slightly staggered formation. He selected the one in the rear as a prime candidate for escape. It was only a few meters from a narrow ravine they could move in without being seen, and, more important, it was out of easy view of the crew seated in the forward craft. "Pass the word," he ordered over the sounds of battle. "We're going to hijack the second chopper in line." Pitt shot uncontrollably down the side of the temple, like a plummeting boulder on a path that took him between the stone animal heads protruding from the convex sloping walls with only centimeters to spare. His hands gripped the knife handles like vices, and he pushed with all the strength in his sinewy arms as the breaking blades began to throw out sparks of protest from the friction of steel against hard stone. The rear edges of the rubber heels on his sneakers were being ground smooth by the rough surface of the wall. And yet he accelerated with dismaying speed. His two greatest fears were falling forward and tumbling head-first like a cannonball into the ground, or striking with such force that he broke a leg. Either calamity, and he was finished. Dead meat for the Peruvians who wouldn't treat him kindly for killing their officers.
Still fighting grimly but hopelessly to arrest his velocity, Pitt flexed his legs a split second before he struck the ground with appalling force. He let loose of the knives on impact as his feet drove into the ooze of rain-soaked soil. Using his momentum, he rolled over on one shoulder and tumbled twice as required in a hard parachute landing. He lay in the mud for a few moments, thankful he hadn't landed on a rock, before rising experimentally to his feet and checking for damage. One ankle slightly sprained, but still in working condition, a few abrasions on his hands, and an aching shoulder appeared to be the only damage. The damp earth had saved him from serious injury. The faithful mattress was in shreds. He took a deep breath, happy at still being intact. Having no time to waste, Pitt broke into a run, keeping as much of the ruins as possible between him and the troops massing for an assault up the temple stairs. Giordino could only hope that Pitt had survived the rockets and somehow made it safely down the wall of the temple without being spotted and shot. It seemed an impossible act, Giordino thought. Pitt was seemingly indestructible, but the old faceless man with the scythe catches up to us all. That he might catch up with Pitt was a prospect Giordino could not accept. It was inconceivable to him that Pitt could die anywhere but in bed with a beautiful woman or in a nursing home for aged lovers. Giordino crouched and ran into a blind position behind the trailing helicopter as a squad of troops began charging up the precipitous temple steps. The reserve squad remained below while pouring a covering storm of rifle fire at the now shattered palace of the dead. Every one of the Peruvians had his attention focused on the attack. No one saw Giordino, clutching an automatic rifle, steal around the tail boom of the helicopter and enter through the rear clamshell doors. He hurried inside and dropped flat, his eyes taking in the empty troop carrier and cargo compartment, and the two pilots in the cockpit with their backs turned to him, intently watching the one-sided battle. With practiced stealth, Giordino moved with incredible quickness for a man built like a compact bulldozer. The pilots did not hear him or feel his presence as he came up behind their seats. Giordino reversed the rifle and clubbed the co-pilot on the back of the neck. The pilot heard the thud and twisted around in his seat, staring briefly at Giordino more from curiosity than dread. Before he could blink an eye, Giordino rammed the butt of the steel folding rifle stock against the pilot's forehead. Quickly he dragged the unconscious pilots to the doorway and dumped them on the ground. He frantically waved to Shannon, Rogers, and the students who were hiding in the ravine. "Hurry!" he shouted. "For God's sake, hurry!" His words carried clearly above the sounds of the fighting. The archaeologists needed no further urging. They broke from cover and dashed through the open door into the helicopter in seconds. Giordino had already returned to the cockpit and was hurriedly scanning the instruments and the console between the pilot's seats to familiarize himself with the controls. "Are we all here?" he asked Shannon as she slipped into the co-pilot seat beside him. "All but Pitt." He did not reply, but glanced out the window. The troops on the stairway, becoming more courageous at encountering no defensive fire, surged onto the landing and inside the fallen palace of the dead. Only seconds were left before the attackers realized they'd been had. Giordino turned his attention back to the controls. The helicopter was an old Russian-built Mi-8 assault transport, designated a HIP-C by NATO during the Cold War years. A rather ancient, ugly craft, thought Giordino, with twin 1,500-horsepower engines that could carry 4 crew and 30 passengers. Since the engines were already turning, Giordino placed his right hand on the throttles. "You heard me?" said Shannon nervously. "Your friend isn't with us." "I heard." With a total absence of emotion, Giordino increased power. Pitt crouched behind a stone building and peered around a corner. Hearing the growing whine of the turboshaft engines and seeing the 5-bladed main rotor slowly increase its revolutions. An hour previously, it had taken no little persuasion for him to convince Giordino that he must take off whether Pitt arrived or not. The life of one man was not worth the death of 13 others. Though only 30 meters, 98 feet of open ground, completely devoid of any brush or cover, separated Pitt from the helicopter, it seemed more like a mile and a half. There was no longer any need for caution. He had to make a run for it. He leaned down and gave his bad ankle a fast massage to knead out a growing tenseness. He felt little pain, but it was beginning to tighten up and grow numb. No time left if he wanted to save himself. He plunged forward like a sprinter and raced into the open. The rotors were beating the ground into dust when Giordino lifted the old Hip C into a hover. He gave one fast scan of the instrument panel to see if it showed any red lights, and tried to sense any strange noises or weird vibrations. Nothing seemed wrong, as the weary engines of an aircraft badly overdue for an overhaul responded in a businesslike manner as he dipped the nose and increased power. In the main compartment, the students and Rogers saw Pitt launch his dash toward the gaping clamshell doors. They all began shouting encouragement as he pounded over the soft ground. Their shouts turned urgent as a sergeant happened to glance away from the battle scene and saw Pitt chasing after the rising helicopter. He immediately shouted for the men of the reserve squad who were still waiting for the order to advance up the stairway. The sergeant's shouts, they were almost screams, carried over the last echoes of the firing from atop the temple. "They're escaping! Shoot, for the love of Jesus, shoot them!" The troops did not respond as ordered. Pitt was in a direct line of fire with a helicopter. To fire at him meant riddling their own aircraft. They hesitated, unsure of following the frantic sergeant's commands. Only one man lifted his rifle and fired. Pitt ignored the bullet that cut a crease in his right thigh. He had other priorities than feeling pain. And then he was under the long tail boom and in the shadow of the clamshell doors, and Rogers and the Peruvian young people were on their stomachs, leaning out, reaching out to him in the opening between the doors. The helicopter shuddered as it was buffeted by its own downdraft and lurched backward. Pitt extended his arms and jumped. Giordino bent the helicopter into a hard turn, putting the rotor blades dangerously close to a grove of trees. A bullet shattered his side window and sprayed a shower of silvery fragments across the cockpit, cutting a small gash across his nose. Another round plunked into the rear frame of his seat, missing his spinal cord by a whisker. The helicopter took several more hits before he yanked it over the grove and below the far side, out of the line of fire from the Peruvian assault force. Soon out of range, he went into a left climbing turn until he had enough altitude to pass over the mountains. At almost 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, he had expected to find barren, rocky slopes above a timber line, but was mildly surprised to find the peaks so heavily forested. Once clear of the valley, he set a course to the west. Only then did he turn to Shannon. "You all right?" "They were trying to kill us," she said mechanically. "Must not like gringos," Giordino replied, surveying Shannon for damage. Seeing no signs of punctures or blood, he refocused on flying the aircraft and pulled the lever that closed the clamshell doors. Only then did he shout over his shoulder into the main cabin. "Anyone hit back there?" "Just little old me." Giordino and Shannon twisted in their seats in unison at recognizing the voice. Pitt. A rather exhausted and mud-encrusted Pitt, it was true. A Pitt with one leg seeping blood through a hastily tied bandana. But a Pitt as indefatigable as ever leaned through the cabin door with a devilish smirk on his face. A vast wave of relief swept over Giordino, and he flashed a smile. "You almost missed your bus again. And you still owe me a Dixieland band." Shannon smiled, knelt in her seat facing backward, threw her arms around Pitt, and gave him a big hug. "I was afraid you wouldn't make it." "I damn near didn't." She looked down, and her smile faded. "You're bleeding." A parting shot from the soldiers just before Rogers and the students pulled me on board. Bless their hearts. "We've got to get you to a hospital. It looks serious." "Not unless they were using bullets dipped in hemlock," Pitt said facetiously. "You should get off that leg. Take my seat." Pitt eased Shannon around and pressed her back into the co-pilot seat. "Stay put. I'll sit in coach with the rest of the peasants." He paused and looked around the control cabin. "This is a real antique." "She shakes, rattles, and rolls," said Giordino, "but she hangs in the air." Pitt leaned over Giordino's shoulder and examined the instrument panel, his eyes coming to rest on the fuel gauges. He reached over and tapped the instrument glass. Both needles quivered just below the 3/4 mark. "How far do you figure she'll take us?" "Range should be in the neighborhood of 350 kilometers. If a bullet didn't bite a hole in one of the tanks, I'd guess she'll carry us about 280. Must be a chart of the area around somewhere and a pair of dividers." Shannon found a navigation kit in a pocket beside her seat and passed it to Pitt. He removed a chart and unfolded it against her back. Using the dividers, careful not to stick the points through the chart paper and stab her, Pitt laid out a course to the Peruvian coast. "I estimate roughly 300 kilometers to the deep fathom." "What's deep fathom?" asked Shannon. "Our research ship." "Surely you don't intend to land at sea when one of Peru's largest cities is much closer?" "She means the international airport at Trujillo," explained Giordino. "The Solpe Machaco has too many friends to suit me," said Pitt. "Friends who have enough clout to order in a regiment of mercenaries at a moment's notice. Once they spread the word we stole a helicopter and sent the pride of their military to a graveyard, our lives won't be worth the spare tire inside the trunk of an Edsel. We'll be safer on board an American ship outside their offshore limit, until we can arrange for our U.S. Embassy staff to make a full report to honest officials in the Peruvian government." "I see your point," agreed Shannon. "Overlook the archaeology students. They know the whole story. Their parents are very influential and will see that a true account of their abduction and the pillaging of national treasures hits the news media." "You're assuming, of course," Giordino said matter-of-factly, "that a Peruvian posse won't cut us off at any one of 20 passes between here and the sea." "On the contrary," replied Pitt, "I'm counting on it. Care to bet the other assault helicopter isn't chasing our tail rotor as we speak?" "So we hug the ground and dodge sheep and cows until we cross over water," acknowledged Giordino. "Precisely. Cuddling with low clouds won't hurt matters either." "Forgetting a little something, aren't you?" said Shannon wearily, as though reminding a husband who neglected to carry out the trash. "If my math is correct, our fuel tanks will run dry 20 kilometers short of your ship. I hope you aren't proposing we swim the rest of the way." "We solved that insignificant problem," said Pitt calmly, "by calling up the ship and arranging for it to run full speed on a converging course." "Every click helps," said Giordino, "but we'll still be cutting it a mite fine." "Survival is guaranteed," Pitt said confidently. "This aircraft carries life vests for everyone aboard, plus 2 life rafts. I know, I checked when I walked through the main cabin." He paused, turned, and looked back. Rogers was checking to see all the students had their shoulder harnesses on properly. "Our pursuers will be on to us the instant you make contact with your vessel," Shannon persisted bleakly. "They'll know exactly where to intercept and shoot us down." "Not," Pitt replied loftily, "if I play my cards right." Setting the office chair to almost a full reclining position, communications technician Jim Stuckey settled in comfortably and began reading a paperback mystery novel by Wick Downing. He had finally gotten used to the thump that reverberated throughout the hull of the Numa oceanographic ship Deep Fathom every time the sonar unit bounced a signal off the seafloor of the Peru Basin.
Boredom had set in soon after the vessel began endlessly cruising back and forth, charting the geology 2,500 fathoms below the ship's keel. Stucky was in the middle of the chapter where a woman's body is found floating inside a waterbed when Pitt's voice crackled over the speaker. "Pneuma calling Deep Fathom. You awake, Stucky?" Stucky jerked erect and pressed the transmit button. "This is Deep Fathom. I read you, Pneuma. Please stand by." While Pitt waited, Stucky alerted his skipper over the ship's speaker system. Captain Frank Stewart hurried from the bridge into the communications cabin. "Did I hear you correctly? You're in contact with Pitt and Giordino?" Stucky nodded. "Pitt is standing by." Stewart picked up the microphone. "Dirk, this is Frank Stewart." "Good to hear your beer-soaked voice again, Frank. What have you guys been up to? Admiral Sandecker has been erupting like a volcano the past 24 hours, demanding to know your status." "Believe me, Frank, it hasn't been a good day." "What is your present position?" "Somewhere over the Andes in an antique Peruvian military chopper." "What happened to our Pneuma helicopter?" Stewart demanded. "The Red Baron shot it down," said Pitt hastily. "That's not important. Listen to me carefully. We took bullet strikes in our fuel tanks. We can't stay in the air for more than a half hour. Please meet and pick us up in the town square of Chiclayo. You'll find it on your charts of the Peruvian mainland. Use our Pneuma backup copter." Stewart looked down at Stucky. Both men exchanged puzzled glances. Stewart pressed the transmit button again. "Please repeat. I don't read you clearly." "We are required to land in Chiclayo due to loss of fuel. Rendezvous with us in the survey helicopter and transport us back to the ship. Besides Giordino and me, there are 12 passengers." Stewart looked dazed. "What in hell is going on? He and Giordino flew off the ship with our only bird, and now they're flying a military aircraft that's been shot up with 12 people on board. What's this baloney about a backup chopper?" "Stand by," Stewart transmitted to Pitt. Then he reached out and picked up the ship's phone and buzzed the bridge. "Find a map of Peru in the chart room and bring it to communications right away." "You think Pitt has fallen off his pogo stick?" asked Stucky. "Not in 1,000 years," answered Stewart. "Those guys are in trouble, and Pitt's laying a red herring to mislead eavesdroppers." A crewman brought the map, and Stewart stretched it flat on a desk. "Their rescue mission took them on a course almost due east of here. Chiclayo is a good 75 kilometers southwest of his flight path." "Well, now that we've established his con job," said Stucky, "what's Pitt's game plan?" "We'll soon find out." Stewart picked up the microphone and transmitted. "Pneuma, are you still with us?" "Still here, pal," came Pitt's imperturbable voice. "I will fly the spare copter to Chiclayo and pick up you and your passengers myself. Do you copy?" "Much appreciated, Skipper. Always happy to see you never do things halfway. Have a beer waiting when I arrive." "Will do," answered Stewart. "And put on some speed, will you?" said Pitt. "I need a bath real bad. See you soon." Stucky stared at Stewart and laughed. "Since when did you learn to fly a helicopter?" Stewart laughed back. "Only in my dreams." "Do you mind telling me what I missed?" "In a second." Stewart picked up the ship's phone again and snapped out orders. "Pull in the sonar sensor and set a new course on 090 degrees. Soon as the sensor is secured, give me full speed. And no excuses from the chief engineer that his precious engines have to be coddled. I want every revolution." He hung up the phone with a thoughtful expression. "Where were we? Oh, yes, you don't know the score." "Is it some sort of riddle?" Stucky muttered. "Not at all. Obvious to me.
Pitt and Giordino don't have enough fuel to reach the ship, so we're going to put on all speed and meet them approximately halfway between here and the shore, hopefully before they're forced to ditch in water infested with sharks. Chapter 9. Giordino whipped along a bare 10 meters, 33 feet above the tops of the trees at only 144 kilometers, 90 miles an hour. The 20-year-old helicopter was capable of flying almost another 100 kilometers faster, but he reduced speed to conserve what little fuel he had left after passing over the mountains. Only one more range of foothills and a narrow coastal plain separated the aircraft from the sea. Every third minute he glanced warily at the fuel gauges. The needles were edging uncomfortably close to the red. His eyes returned to the green foliage rushing past below. The forest was thick, and the clearings were scattered with large boulders. It was a decidedly unfriendly place to force-land a helicopter. Pitt had limped back into the cargo compartment and begun passing out the life vests. Shannon followed, firmly took the vests out of his hands, and handed them to Rogers. "No, you don't," she said firmly, pushing Pitt into a canvas seat mounted along the bulkhead of the fuselage. She nodded at the loosely knotted, blood-soaked bandana around his leg. "You sit down and stay put." She found a first-aid kit in a metal locker and knelt in front of him. Without the slightest sign of nervous stress, she cut off Pitt's pant leg, cleaned the wound, and competently sewed the 8 stitches to close the wound before wrapping a bandage around it. "Nice job," said Pitt admiringly. "You missed your calling as an angel of mercy." "You were lucky." She snapped the lid on the first-aid kit. The bullet merely sliced the skin. "Why do I feel as though you've acted on General Hospital?" Shannon smiled. "I was raised on a farm with 5 brothers who were always discovering new ways to injure themselves." "What turned you to archaeology?" "There was an old Indian burial mound in one corner of our wheat field. I used to dig around it for arrowheads. For a book report in high school, I found a text on the excavation of the Hopewell Indian culture burial mounds in southern Ohio. Inspired, I began digging into the site on our farm. After finding several pieces of pottery and 4 skeletons, I was hooked. Hardly a professional dig, mind you. I learned how to excavate properly in college and became fascinated with cultural development in the Central Andes, and made up my mind to specialize in that area." Pitt looked at her silently for a moment. "When did you first meet Doc Miller?" "Only briefly, about 6 years ago, when I was working on my doctorate. I attended a lecture he gave on the Inca highway network that ran from the Colombian-Ecuador border almost 5,000 kilometers to central Chile. It was his work that inspired me to focus my studies on Andean culture. I've been coming down here ever since." "Then you didn't really know him very well?" Pitt questioned. Shannon shook her head. "Like most archaeologists, we concentrated on our own pet projects. We corresponded occasionally and exchanged data. About 6 months ago, I invited him to come along on this expedition to supervise the Peruvian university student volunteers. He was between projects and accepted. Then he kindly offered to fly down from the States 5 weeks early to begin preparations, arranging permits from the Peruvians, setting up the logistics for equipment and supplies, that sort of thing. Juan Chaco and he worked closely together." "When you arrived, did you notice anything different about him?" A curious look appeared in Shannon's eyes. "What an odd question." "His looks, his actions," Pitt persisted. She thought a moment. "Since Phoenix, he had grown a beard and lost about 15 pounds, but now that I think of it, he rarely removed his sunglasses." "Any change in his voice?" She shrugged. "A little deeper, perhaps. I thought he had a cold."
Did you notice whether he wore a ring, one with a large amber setting?" Her eyes narrowed. "A 60-million-year-old piece of yellow amber with the fossil of a primitive ant in the center? Doc was proud of that ring. I remember him wearing it during the Inca Road survey, but it wasn't on his hand at the Sacred Well. When I asked him why it was missing, he said the ring became loose on his finger after his weight loss, and he left it home to be resized. How do you know about Doc's ring?" Pitt had been wearing the amber ring he had taken from the corpse at the bottom of the Sacred Well with the setting unseen under his finger. He slipped it off and handed it to Shannon without speaking. She held it up to the light from a round window, staring in amazement at the tiny ancient insect embedded in the amber. "Where?" Her voice trailed off. "Whoever posed as Doc murdered him and took his place. You accepted the impostor because there was no reason not to. The possibility of foul play never entered your mind. The killer's only mistake was forgetting to remove the ring when he threw Doc's body into the sinkhole." "You're saying Doc was murdered before I left the States?" she stated in bewilderment. "Only a day or two after he arrived at the campsite," Pitt explained. "Judging from the condition of the body, he must have been underwater for more than a month. Strange that Miles and I missed seeing him." "Not so strange. You descended directly in front of the passage to the adjoining cavern and were sucked in almost immediately. I reached the bottom on the opposite side and was able to swim a search grid, looking for what I thought would be 2 fresh bodies before the surge caught me. Instead, I found Doc's remains and the bones of a 16th-century Spanish soldier." "So Doc really was murdered," she said as a look of horror dawned on her face. "Juan Chaco must have known, because he was the liaison for our project and was working with Doc before we arrived. Is it possible he was involved?" Pitt nodded. Up to his eyeballs. "If you were smuggling ancient treasures, where could you find a better informant and frontman than an internationally respected archaeological expert and government official?" "Then who was the impostor?" "Another agent of the Solpe Machaco. A canny operator who staged a masterful performance of his death with Amaru's help. Perhaps he's one of the men at the top of the organization who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. We may never know." "If he murdered Doc, he deserves to be hanged," Shannon said, her hazel eyes glinting with anger. "At least we'll be able to nail Juan Chaco to the door of a Peruvian courthouse." Pitt suddenly tensed and swung toward the cockpit as Giordino threw the helicopter in a steeply banked circle. "What's up?" "A gut feeling," Giordino answered. "I decided to run a 360 to check our tail. Good thing I'm sensitive to vibes. We've got company." Pitt pushed himself to his feet, returned to the cockpit, and, favoring his leg, eased into the co-pilot's seat. "Bandits or good guys?" he asked. "Our pals who dropped in on us at the temple didn't fall for your artful dodge to Chiclayo." Without taking his hands from the controls, Giordino nodded out of the windshield to his left at a helicopter crossing a low ridge of mountains to the east. "They must have guessed our course and overhauled us after you reduced speed to conserve fuel," Pitt surmised. "No racks mounting air-to-air rockets," observed Giordino. "They'll have to shoot us down with rifles." A burst of flame and a puff of smoke erupted from the open forward passenger door of the pursuing aircraft, and a rocket soared through the sky. Passing so close to the nose of the helicopter, Pitt and Giordino felt they could have reached out the side windows and touched it. "Correction," Pitt called. "A 40-millimeter rocket launcher, the same one they used against the temple." Giordino slammed the collective pitch into an abrupt ascent and shoved the throttles to their stops in an attempt to throw off the launcher team's aim. "Grab your rifle and keep them busy until I can reach those low clouds along the coast." "Tough luck," Pitt shouted over the shrill whine of the engines. "I tossed it away, and my Colt is empty. Any of you carry a gun on board?"
Giordino made an imperceptible nod as he hurled the chopper in another violent maneuver. "I can't speak for the rest of them. You'll find mine wedged in a corner behind the cabin bulkhead." Pitt took a radio headset that was hanging on the arm of his seat and clamped it over his ears. Then he struggled out of his seat and clutched both sides of the open cockpit door with his hands to stay on his feet during a sharp turn. He plugged the lead from the headset into a socket mounted on the bulkhead and hailed Giordino. "Put on your headset so we can coordinate our defense." Giordino didn't answer as he mashed down on the left pedal and skidded the craft around in a flat turn. As if he were juggling, he balanced his movements with the controls while slipping the headset over his ears. He winced and involuntarily ducked as another rocket tore through the air less than a meter under the belly of the helicopter and exploded in an orange burst of flame against the palisade of a low mountain. Grabbing whatever handhold was within reach, Pitt staggered to the side passenger door, undogged the latches, and slid the door back until it was wide open. Shannon, her face showing more concern than fear, crawled across the floor with a cargo rope and wrapped one end around Pitt's waist as he was reaching for the automatic rifle Giordino had used to knock out the Peruvian pilots. Then she tied the opposite end to a longitudinal strut. "Now you won't fall out," she exclaimed. Pitt smiled. "I don't deserve you." Then he was lying flat on his stomach, aiming the rifle out the door. "I'm ready, Al. Give me a clear shot." Giordino fought to twist the helicopter so that Pitt would face the blind side of the attackers. Because the passenger doors were positioned on the same side of both helicopters, the Peruvian pilot was faced with the same dilemma. He might have risked opening the clamshell doors in the aft end to allow the mercenary rifleman to blast away with an open line of fire, but that would have slowed his airspeed and made control of the chopper unwieldy. Like old propeller-driven warbirds tangling in a dogfight, the pilots maneuvered for an advantage, hurling their aircraft around the sky in a series of acrobatics never intended by their designers. His opponent knew his stuff, thought Giordino, with the respect of one professional for another. Outgunned by the military mercenaries, he felt like a mouse tormented by a cat before becoming a quick snack. His eyes darted from the instruments to his nemesis, then down at the ground to make certain he didn't pile into a low ridge or a tree. He yanked back the collective and broadened the pitch of the rotor blades to increase their bite in the damp air. The chopper shot upward in a maneuver matched by the other pilot. But then Giordino pushed the nose down and mashed his foot on the right rudder pedal, accelerating and throwing the craft on its side under his attacker and giving Pitt a straight shot. "Now!" he yelled in his microphone. Pitt didn't aim at the pilots in the cockpit. He sighted at the engine hump below the rotor and squeezed the trigger. The gun spat twice and went silent.
This book is continued on Disc 4. Disc 4.
Pitt didn't aim at the pilots in the cockpit. He sighted at the engine hump below the rotor and squeezed the trigger. The gun spat twice and went silent. "What's wrong?" inquired Giordino. "No gunfire. I run interference to the goal line and you fumble the ball." "This gun had only 2 rounds in it," Pitt snapped back. "When I took it off one of Amaru's gunmen, I didn't stop to count the shells." Furious with frustration, Pitt jerked out the clip and saw it was empty. "Did any of you bring a gun on board?" he shouted to Rogers and the petrified students. Rogers, tightly strapped in a seat with legs braced against a bulkhead to avoid being bounced around by Giordino's violent tactics, spread his hands. "We left them behind when we made a break for the ship." At that instant a rocket burst through a port window, flamed across the width of the fuselage, and exited through the opposite side of the helicopter without bursting or injuring anyone. Designed to detonate after striking armored vehicles or fortified bunkers, the rocket failed to explode after striking thin aluminum and plastic. "If one hits the turbines," Pitt thought uneasily, "it's all over." He stared wildly about the cabin, saw that they had all released their shoulder harnesses and lay huddled on the floor under the seats, as if the canvas webbing and small tubular supports could stop a 40mm tank-killing rocket. He cursed as the wildly swaying aircraft threw him against the doorframe. Shannon saw the furious look on Pitt's face, the despair as he flung the empty rifle out the open door. And yet she stared at him with absolute faith in her eyes. She had come to know him well enough in the past 24 hours to know he was not a man who would willingly accept defeat. Pitt caught the look, and it infuriated him. "What do you expect me to do?" he demanded. "Leap across space and brain them with the jawbone of an ass? Or maybe they'll go away if I throw rocks at them." Pitt broke off as his eyes fell on one of the life rafts. He broke into a wild grin. "Al, you hear me?" "I'm a little busy to take calls," Giordino answered tensely. "Lay this antique on her port side and fly above them. Whatever you're concocting, make it quick before they put a rocket up our nose or we run out of fuel." "Backed by popular demand," Pitt said, becoming his old cheerful self again. Mandrake Pitt and his death-defying magic act. He unsnapped the buckles on the tie-down straps holding one of the life rafts to the floor. The fluorescent orange raft was labeled 20-man flotation unit in English and weighed over 45 kilograms, 100 pounds. Leaning out the door secured by the rope Shannon had tied around his waist, both legs and feet spread and set, he hoisted the uninflated life raft onto his shoulder and waited. Giordino was tiring. Helicopters require constant hands-on concentration just to stay in the air, because they are made up of 1,000 opposing forces that want nothing to do with each other. The general rule of thumb is that most pilots fly solo for an hour. After that, they turn control over to their backup or co-pilot. Giordino had been behind the controls for an hour and a half, was denied sleep for the past 36 hours, and now the strain of throwing the aircraft all over the sky was rapidly draining what strength he had in reserve. For almost 6 minutes, an eternity in a dogfight, he had prevented his adversary from gaining a brief advantage for a clear shot from the men manning the rocket launcher. The other craft passed directly across Giordino's vulnerable glass-enclosed cockpit. For a brief instant in time, he could clearly see the Peruvian pilot. The face under the combat flight helmet flashed a set of white teeth and waved. "The bastard is laughing at me," Giordino blurted in fury. "What did you say?" came Pitt. "Those fornicating baboons think this is funny," Giordino said savagely. He knew what he had to do. He had noticed an almost indiscernible quirk to the enemy pilot's flying technique. When he bent left, there was no hesitation, but he was a fraction of a second slow in banking right. Giordino feinted left and abruptly threw the nose skyward and curled right. The other pilot caught the feint and promptly went left, but reacted too slowly to Giordino's wild ascending turn and twist in the opposite direction. Before he could counter, Giordino had hurled his machine around and over the attacker. Pitt's opportunity came in just the blink of an eye, but his timing was right on the money. Lifting the life raft above his head with both hands as easily as if it were a sofa pillow, he thrust it out the open door as the Peruvian chopper whipped beneath him. The orange bundle dropped with the impetus of a bowling ball and smashed through one of the gyrating rotor blades 2 meters, about 6 feet from the tip. The blade shattered into metallic slivers that spiraled outward from the centrifugal force. Now unbalanced, the remaining 4 blades whirled in ever-increasing vibration until they broke away from the rotor hub in a rain of small pieces. The big helicopter seemed to hang poised for a moment before it yawed in circles and angled nose first toward the ground at 190 kilometers, 118 miles an hour. Pitt hung out the door and watched, fascinated, as the Peruvian craft bored through the trees and crashed into a low hill, only a few meters below the summit. He stared at the glinting shreds of metal that flew off into the branches of the trees. The big injured bird came to rest on its right side, a crumpled lump of twisted metal. And then it was lost in a huge fireball that erupted and wrapped it in flames and black smoke. Giordino eased back on the throttles and made a slow circular pass over the column of smoke. But neither he nor Pitt saw any evidence of life. "This has to be the first time in history an aircraft was knocked out of the sky by a life raft," said Giordino. "Improvisation." Pitt laughed softly, bowing to Shannon, Rogers, and the students, who were all applauding with rejuvenated spirits. "Improvisation." Then he added, "Fine piece of flying, Al. None of us would be breathing but for you." "Ain't it the truth? Ain't it the truth?" said Giordino, turning the nose of the craft toward the west and reducing the throttle settings to conserve fuel. Pitt pulled the passenger door closed, redogged the latches, untied Shannon's line from around his waist, and returned to the cockpit. "How does our fuel look?" "Fuel? What fuel?" Pitt gazed over Giordino's shoulder at the gauges. Both showed flickering red warning lights. He could also see the drawn look of fatigue on his friend's face. "Take a break and let me spell you at the controls." "I got us this far. I'll take us what little distance we have left before the tanks run dry." Pitt did not waste his breath in debate. He never ceased to marvel at Giordino's intrepid calm, his glacial fortitude. He could have searched the world and never found another friend like the tough, burly Italian. "Okay, you take her in. I'll sit this one out and pray for a tailwind." A few minutes later they crossed over the shoreline and headed out to sea. A resort with attractive lawns and a large swimming pool encircled a small cove with a white sand beach. The sunbathing tourists looked up at the low-flying helicopter and waved. With nothing better to do, Pitt waved back. Pitt returned to the cargo cabin and approached Rogers. "We've got to dump as much weight as possible, except for survival equipment like the life vests and the remaining raft. Everything else goes, excess clothing, tools, hardware, seats, anything that isn't welded or bolted down." Everyone pitched in and passed whatever objects they could find to Pitt, who heaved them out the passenger door. When the cabin was bare, the chopper was lighter by almost 136 kilograms, 300 pounds. Before he closed the door again, Pitt looked aft. Thankfully, he didn't see any pursuing aircraft. He was certain the Peruvian pilot had radioed the sighting and his intention to attack, blowing Pitt's Chiclayo smokescreen. But he doubted the Solpe Machaco would suspect the loss of their mercenary soldiers and helicopter for at least another 10 minutes. And if they belatedly totaled the score and whistled up a Peruvian Air Force fighter jet to intercept, then it would be too late. Any attack on an unarmed American research ship would stir up serious diplomatic repercussions between the United States government and Peru, a situation the struggling South American nation could ill afford. Pitt was on safe ground in assuming that no local bureaucrat or military officer would risk political disaster, regardless of any under-the-table payoff by the Solpe Machaco. Pitt limped back to the cockpit, slid into the co-pilot's seat, and picked up the radio microphone. He brushed aside all caution as he pressed the transmit button. To hell with any bought-and-paid-for Solpe Machaco cronies who were monitoring the airwaves, he thought. "Numa calling Deep Fathom. Talk to me, Stucky." "Come in, Numa. This is Deep Fathom. What is your position?" "My, what big eyes you have, and how your voice has changed, Grandma." "Say again, Numa." "Not even a credible effort," Pitt laughed. "Rich Little you ain't." He looked over at Giordino. "We've got a comic impersonator on our party line." "I think you better give him our position," Giordino said, with more than a trace of cynicism in his voice. "Right you are." Pitt nodded. "Deep Fathom, this is Numa. Our position is just south of the Magic Castle between Jungle Land and the Pirates of the Caribbean." "Please repeat your position," came the voice of the flustered mercenary who had broken in on Pitt's call to Stucky. What's this, a radio commercial for Disneyland? Stucky's familiar voice popped over the speaker. Well, well, the genuine article. What took you so long to answer, Stucky? I was listening to what my alter ego had to say. You guys landed in Chiclayo yet? We were sidetracked and decided to head home, said Pitt. Is the skipper handy? He's on the bridge playing Captain Bligh, lashing the crew in an attempt to set a speed record. Another knot and our rivets will start falling out. We do not have a visual on you. Do you have us on radar? Affirmative, answered Stucky. Change your heading to 272 magnetic. That will put us on a converging course. Altering course to 272, Giordino acknowledged. How far to rendezvous? Pitt asked Stucky. The skipper makes it about 60 kilometers. They should be in sight soon. Pitt looked over at Giordino. What do you think? Giordino stared woefully at the fuel gauges, then at the instrument panel clock. The dial read 10:47 a.m. He couldn't believe so much had happened in so little time, since he and Pitt had responded to the rescue appeal by the impostor of Doc Miller. He swore it took 3 years off his life expectancy. I'm milking her for every liter of fuel at an airspeed of only 40 clicks an hour, he said finally. A slight tailwind off the shore helps, but I estimate we have only another 15 or 20 minutes of flight time left. Your guess is as good as mine. Let us hope the gauges read on the low side, said Pitt. Hello, Stucky. I'm here. You'd better prepare for a water rescue. All predictions point to a wet landing. I'll pass the word to the skipper. Alert me when you ditch. You'll be the first to know. Good luck. The helicopter droned over the tops of the rolling swells. Pitt and Giordino spoke very little. Their ears were tuned to the sound of the turbines, as if expecting them to abruptly go silent at any moment. They instinctively tensed when the fuel warning alarm whooped through the cockpit. So much for the reserves, said Pitt. Now we're flying on fumes. He looked down at the deep cobalt blue of the water only 10 meters, 33 feet, beneath the belly of the chopper. The sea looked reasonably smooth. He figured wave height from trough to crest was less than a meter. The water looked warm and inviting. A power-off landing did not appear to be too rough, and the old Mi-8 should float for a good 60 seconds if Giordino didn't burst the seams when he dropped her in. Pitt called Shannon to the cockpit. She appeared in the doorway, looked down at him, and smiled faintly. Is your ship in sight? Just over the horizon, I should think, but not close enough to reach with the fuel that's left. Tell everybody to prepare for a water landing. Then we do have to swim the rest of the way, she said cynically. A mere technicality, said Pitt. Have Rogers move the life raft close to the passenger door and be ready to heave it in the water as soon as we ditch. And impress upon him the importance of pulling the inflation cord after the raft is safely through the door. I, for one, do not want to get my feet wet. Giordino pointed dead ahead. The deep fathom. Pitt nodded as he squinted at the dark, tiny speck on the horizon. He spoke into the radio mic. We have you on visual, Stucky. Come to the party, answered Stucky. We'll open the bar early just for you. Heaven forbid, said Pitt, elaborately sarcastic. I don't imagine the Admiral will take kindly to that suggestion. Their employer, Chief Director of the National Underwater and Marine Agency, Admiral James Sandecker, had a regulation etched in stone banning all alcoholic spirits from pneuma vessels. A vegetarian and a fitness nut, Sandecker thought he was adding years to the hired help's lifespan. As with prohibition in the 1920s, men who seldom touched the stuff began smuggling cases of beer on board or buying it in foreign ports. Would you prefer a hearty glass of Ovaltine? Retorted Stucky. Only if you mix it with carrot juice and alfalfa sprouts. We just lost an engine, announced Giordino conversationally. Pitt's eyes darted to the instruments. Across the board, the needles of the gauges monitoring the port turbine were flickering back to their stops. He turned and looked up at Shannon. "Warn everyone that we'll impact the water on the starboard side of the aircraft." Shannon looked confused. "Why not land vertically?" "If we go in bottom first, the rotor blades settle, strike the water, and shatter on a level with the fuselage. The whirling fragments can easily penetrate the cabin's skin, especially the cockpit, resulting in the loss of our intrepid pilot's head. Coming down on the side throws the shattered blades out and away from us." "Why the starboard side?" "I don't have a chalk and a blackboard," snapped Pitt in exasperation. "So you'll die happy. It has to do with the directional rotation of the rotor blades and the fact the exit door is on the port side." Enlightened, Shannon nodded. "Understood." "Immediately after impact," Pitt continued, "get the students out the door before this thing sinks. Now get to your seat and buckle up." Then he slapped Giordino on the shoulder. "Take her in while you still have power," he said as he snapped on his safety harness. Giordino needed no coaxing. Before he lost his remaining engine, he pulled back on the collective pitch and pulled back the throttle on his one operating engine. As the helicopter lost its forward motion from a height of 3 meters above the sea, he leaned it gently onto the starboard side. The rotor blades smacked the water and snapped off in a cloud of debris and spray as the craft settled in the restless waves with the awkward poise of a pregnant albatross. The impact came with the jolt of a speeding car hitting a sharp dip in the road. Giordino shut down the one engine and was pleasantly surprised to find the old Mi-8 Hip C floating drunkenly in the sea as if she belonged there. "End of the line," Pitt boomed. "Everyone the hell out." The gentle lapping of the waves against the fuselage came as a pleasant contrast to the fading whine of the engines and thump of the rotor blades. The pungent salt air filled the stuffy interior of the compartment when Rogers slid open the passenger door and dropped the collapsible 20-person life raft into the water. He was extra careful not to pull the inflation cord too soon, and was relieved to hear the hiss of compressed air and see the raft puff out safely beyond the door. In a few moments it was bobbing alongside the helicopter, its mooring line tightly clutched in Rogers' hand. "Out you go," Rogers yelled, herding the young Peruvian archaeology students through the door and into the raft. Pitt released his safety harness and hurried into the rear cabin. Shannon and Rogers had the evacuation running smoothly. All but 3 students had climbed into the raft. A quick examination of the aircraft made it clear she couldn't stay afloat for long. The clamshell doors were buckled from the impact just enough to allow water to surge in around the seams. Already the floor of the fuselage was beginning to slant toward the rear, and the waves were sloshing over the sill of the open passenger door. "We haven't much time," he said, helping Shannon into the raft. Rogers went next, and then he turned to Giordino. "Your turn, Al." Giordino would have none of it. Tradition of the sea, all walking wounded go first. Before Pitt could protest, Giordino shoved him out the door, and then followed as the water swept over his ankles. Breaking out the raft's paddles, they pushed clear of the helicopter as its long tail boom dipped into the waves. Then a large swell surged through the opening passenger door, and the helicopter slipped backward into the uncaring sea. She disappeared with a faint gurgle and a few ripples, her shattered rotor blades being the last to go, the stumps slowly rotating from the force of the current as if she were descending to the seafloor under her own power. The water surged through her open door, and she plunged under the waves to a final landing on the seafloor. No one spoke. They all seemed saddened to see the helicopter go. It was as if they all suffered a personal loss. Pitt and Giordino were at home on the water. The others, suddenly finding themselves floating on a vast sea, felt an awful sense of emptiness coupled with the dread of helplessness. The latter feeling was particularly enhanced when a shark's fin abruptly broke the water and ominously began circling the raft. "All your fault," Giordino said to Pitt in mock exasperation. "He's homed in on the scent of blood from your leg wound." Pitt peered into the transparent water, studying the sleek shape as it passed under the raft, recognizing the horizontal stabilizer-like head with the eyes mounted like aircraft wing lights on the tips. A hammerhead, no more than 2.5 meters long. I shall ignore him. Shannon gave a shudder and moved closer to Pitt and clutched his arm. What if he decides to take a bite out of the raft and we sink? Pitt shrugged. Sharks seldom find life rafts appetizing. He invited his pals for dinner, said Giordino, pointing to 2 more fins cutting the water. Pitt could see the beginnings of panic on the faces of the young students. He nestled into a comfortable position on the bottom of the raft, elevated his feet on the upper float, and closed his eyes. Nothing like a restful nap under a warm sun on a calm sea. Wake me when the ship arrives. Shannon stared at him in disbelief. He must be mad. Giordino quickly sized up Pitt's scheme and settled in. That makes 2 of us. No one knew quite how to react. Every pair of eyes in the raft swiveled from the seemingly dozing men from Numa to the circling sharks and back again. The panic slowly subsided to uneasy apprehension while the minutes crawled by as if they were each an hour long. Other sharks joined the pre-dinner party, but all hearts began filling with newfound hope as the deep fathom hove into view, her bows carving the water in a spray of foam. No one on board knew the old workhorse of Numa's oceanographic fleet could drive so hard. Down in the engine room, the chief engineer, August Burley, a powerfully built man with a portly stomach, walked the catwalk between the ship's big diesels, closely observing the needles on the RPM gauges, which were hard in the red, and listening for any signs of metal fatigue from the overstressed engines. On the bridge, Captain Frank Stewart gazed through binoculars at the tiny splash of orange against the blue sea. "We'll come right up on them at half speed before reversing the engines," he said to the helmsman. "You don't want to stop and drift up to them, Captain?" asked the blond, ponytailed man at the wheel. "They're surrounded by a school of sharks," said Stewart. "We can't waste time with caution." He stepped over and spoke into the ship's speaker system. "We'll approach the survivors on the port side. All available hands prepare to bring them aboard." It was a neat bit of seamanship. Stewart stopped the ship within 2 meters of the life raft with only a slight wash. Several crewmen stared down and waved, leaning far over the railing and bulwark to shout greetings. The boarding ladder had been lowered, and a crewman stood on the lower platform with a boat-hook. He extended it, the end was grabbed by Giordino, and the raft was pulled in alongside the platform. The sharks were forgotten, and everyone began smiling and laughing with unabashed happiness at having survived death without major injuries at least 4 times since being taken hostage. Shannon stared up at the towering hull of the research ship, took in the ungainly superstructure and derricks, and turned to Pitt with a shrewd twinkle in her eyes. "You promised us a 4-star hotel and a refreshing bath. Certainly not a rusty old workboat." Pitt laughed. "A rose by any other name, any port in a storm. So you share my attractive but homespun stateroom. As a gentleman, I'll give you the lower berth while I suffer the indignities of the upper." Shannon looked at him with amusement. "Taking a lot for granted, aren't you?" As Pitt relaxed and kept a paternal eye on the occupants of the raft, who were climbing the ladder one after the other, he smiled fiendishly at Shannon and murmured, "Okay, we'll keep a low profile. You can have the upper, and I'll take the lower." Chapter 10. Juan Chaco's world had cracked and crumbled to dust around him. The disaster in the valley of Viracocha was far worse than anything he could have imagined. His brother had been the first to be killed. The artifact smuggling operation was in shambles, and once the American archaeologist, Shannon Kelsey, and the university students told their story to the news media and government security officials, he would be thrown out of the Department of Archaeology in disgrace. Far worse, there was every possibility he would be arrested,
tried for selling his nation's historical heritage, and sentenced to a very long jail term. He was a man racked with anxiety as he stood beside the motor home in Chachapoya and watched the tilt-rotor aircraft come to a near halt in the air as the twin outboard engines on the end of the wings swiveled from forward flight to vertical. The black, unmarked craft hovered for a few moments before the pilot gently settled the extended landing wheels on the ground. A heavily bearded man in dirty, rumpled shorts and a khaki shirt with an immense blood stain in its center exited the 9-passenger cabin and stepped to the ground. He looked neither right nor left, the expression on his face set and grim. Without a word of greeting, he walked past Chaco and entered the motor home. Like a chastised collie, Chaco followed him inside. Cyrus Saracen, the impersonator of Dr. Stephen Miller, sat heavily behind Chaco's desk and stared icily. "You've heard?" Chaco nodded without questioning the bloodstain on Saracen's shirt. He knew the blood represented a fake gunshot wound. "I received the full report from one of my brother's fellow officers." "Then you know Dr. Kelsey and the university students slipped through our fingers and were rescued by an American oceanographic research ship." "Yes, I am aware of our failure." "I'm sorry about your brother," Saracen said without emotion. "I can't believe he's gone," muttered Chaco, strangely unmoved. "His death doesn't seem possible. The elimination of the archaeologist should have been a simple affair." "To say your people bungled the job is an understatement," said Saracen. "I warned you those 2 divers from Numa were dangerous." "My brother did not expect organized resistance by an army." "An army of 1 man," Saracen said acidly. "I observed the action from a tomb. A lone sniper atop the temple killed the officers and held off 2 squads of your intrepid mercenaries, while his companion overpowered the pilots and commandeered their helicopter. Your brother paid dearly for his overconfidence and stupidity." "How could a pair of divers and a juvenile group of archaeologists scourge a highly trained security force?" Chaco asked in bewilderment. "If we knew the answer to that question, we might learn how they knocked the pursuing helicopter out of the air." Chaco stared at him. "They can still be stopped." "Forget it. I'm not about to compound the disaster by destroying a U.S. government ship and all on board. The damage is already done. According to my sources in Lima, full exposure, including Miller's murder, was communicated to President Fujimori's office by Dr. Kelsey soon after she boarded the ship. By this evening, the story will be broadcast all over the country. The Chachapoyan end of our operation is a washout. We can still bring the artifacts out of the valley." The recent demise of Chaco's brother had not fully pushed aside his greed. Saracen nodded. "I'm ahead of you. A team is on its way to remove whatever pieces survived the rocket attack launched by those idiots under your brother's command. It's a miracle we still have something to show for our efforts. I believe there is a good possibility a clue to the Drake Kipu may still be found in the City of the Dead." "The Drake Kipu." Saracen repeated the words with a faraway look in his eyes. Then he shrugged. "Our organization is already working on another angle for the treasure." "What of Amaru? Is he still alive?" "Unfortunately, yes. He'll live the rest of his days as a eunuch." "Too bad. He was a loyal follower." Saracen sneered. "Loyal to whoever paid him best. Tupac Amaru is a sociopathic killer of the highest order. When I ordered him to abduct Miller and hold him prisoner until we concluded the operation, he put a bullet in the good doctor's heart and threw him in the damned sinkhole. The man has the mind of a rabid dog. He may still prove useful, said Chaco slowly. Useful? How? If I know his mind, he'll swear vengeance on those responsible for his newly acquired handicap. It might be wise to unleash him on Dr. Kelsey and the diver called Pitt, to prevent them from being used by international customs investigators as informants. We'd be skating on thin ice if we turned a crazy man like him loose. But I'll keep your suggestion in mind. Chaco went on. What plans do the Sope Machaco have for me? I am finished here. Now that my countrymen will know I have betrayed their trust with regard to our historical treasures, I could spend the rest of my life in one of our filthy prisons. A foregone conclusion. Saracen shrugged. My sources also revealed that the local police have been ordered to pick you up. They should arrive within the hour. Chaco looked at Saracen for a long moment, then said slowly, I am a scholar and a scientist, not a hardened criminal. There is no telling how much I might reveal during lengthy interrogation, perhaps even torture. Saracen suppressed a smile at the veiled threat. You are a valuable asset we cannot afford to lose. Your expertise and knowledge of ancient Andean cultures is second to none. Arrangements are being made for you to take over our collection facilities in Panama. There you will direct the identification, cataloging, and restoration operations on all artifacts we either purchase from the local huaqueros or acquire under the guise of academic archaeological projects throughout South America. Chaco suddenly looked wolfish. I'm flattered. Of course I accept. Such an important position must pay well. You will receive 2% of the price the artifacts bring at our auction houses in New York and Europe. Chaco was too far down the rungs of the organizational ladder to be privy to the inner secrets of the Sope Machaco, but he well knew the network, and its profits were vast. I will need help getting out of the country. Not to worry, said Saracen. You'll accompany me. He nodded out a window at the ominous black aircraft sitting outside the motorhome, the big three-bladed rotors slowly beating the air at idle. In that aircraft we can be in Bogota, Colombia, within 4 hours. Chaco couldn't believe his luck. 1 minute he was a step away from disgrace and prison for defrauding his government. The next he was on his way to becoming an extremely wealthy man. The memory of his sibling was rapidly fading. They were only half-brothers, and had never been close anyway. While Saracen patiently waited, Chaco quickly gathered some personal items and stuffed them in a suitcase. Then the two men walked out to the aircraft together. Juan Chaco never lived to see Bogota, Colombia. Farmers tilling a field of sweet potatoes near an isolated village in Ecuador paused to look up in the sky at the strange droning sound of the tilt rotor as it passed overhead 500 meters, 1,600 feet above the ground. Suddenly, in what seemed a horror fantasy, they caught sight of the body of a man dropping away from the aircraft. The farmers could also clearly see that the unfortunate man was alive. He frantically kicked his legs and clawed madly at the air, as if he could somehow slow his plunging descent. Chaco struck the ground in the middle of a small corral occupied by a scrawny cow, missing the startled animal by only 2 meters. The farmers came running from their field and stood around the crushed body that was embedded nearly 1/2 meter into the soil. Simple country folk, they did not send a runner to the nearest police station over 60 kilometers, 37 miles to the west. Instead, they reverently lifted the broken remains of the mysterious man who had dropped from the sky and buried him in a small graveyard
beside the ruins of an old church, unlamented and unknown, but embellished in myth for generations yet to come. Chapter 11. The top of Shannon's head was wrapped turban-style with a towel, her hair still wet after a hot, blissful bath in the captain's cabin. She had allowed the Peruvian female students to go first, before luxuriating in the steaming water, while sipping wine and eating a chicken sandwich, thoughtfully provided by Pitt from the ship's galley. Her skin glowed all over and smelled of lavender soap after washing the sweat and grime out of her pores and the jungle mud from under her nails. One of the shorter crewmen, who was close to her size, lent her a pair of coveralls. The only female crew member, a marine geologist, had used most of her wardrobe to reclothe the Peruvian girls. As soon as Shannon was dressed, she promptly threw the swimsuit and the dirty blouse in a trash container. They held memories she'd just as soon forget. After drying and brushing out her hair, she sneaked a bit of Captain Stewart's aftershave lotion. Why is it, she wondered, men never use talcum powder after they shower? She was just tying her long hair in a braid when Pitt knocked on the door. They stood there for a moment staring at each other before breaking into laughter. "I hardly recognized you," she said, taking in a clean and shaven Pitt wearing a brightly flowered Hawaiian aloha shirt and light tan slacks. He was not what you'd call devilishly good-looking, she thought, but any flaws in his craggy face were more than offset by a masculine magnetism she found hard to resist. He was even more tan than she, and his black wavy hair was a perfect match for the incredibly green eyes. "We don't exactly look like the same two people," he said with an engaging smile. "How about a tour of the ship before dinner?" "I'd like that." Then she gave him an appraising look. "I thought I was supposed to bunk down in your cabin. Now I find out the captain has generously offered me his." Pitt shrugged. "The luck of the draw, I guess." "You're a fraud, Dirk Pitt. You're not the lecher you make yourself out to be." "I've always believed intimacy should be drifted into gradually." She suddenly felt uneasy. It was as though his piercing eyes could read her mind. He seemed to sense there was someone else. She forced a smile and wrapped her arm around his. "Where shall we begin?" "You're speaking of the tour, of course." "What else?" The Deep Fathom was a state-of-the-art scientific workboat, and she looked it. Her official designation was superseismic vessel. She was primarily designed for deep ocean geophysical research, but she could also undertake a myriad of other subsea activities. Her giant stern and side cranes, with their huge winches, could be adapted to operate every conceivable underwater function, from mining excavation to deep water salvage and manned and unmanned submersible launch and recovery. The ship's hull was painted in Numa's traditional turquoise with a white superstructure and azure blue cranes. From bow to stern she stretched the length of a football field, berthing up to 35 scientists and 20 crew. Although she didn't look it from the outside, her interior living quarters were as plush as most luxurious passenger liners. Admiral James Sandecker, with rare insight given to few bureaucrats, knew his people could perform more efficiently if treated accordingly, and the Deep Fathom reflected his conviction. Her dining room was fitted out like a fine restaurant, and the galley was run by a first-rate chef. Pitt led Shannon up to the navigation bridge. "Our brain center," he pointed out, sweeping one hand around a vast room filled with digital arrays, computers, and video monitors mounted on a long console that ran the full width of the bridge beneath a massive expanse of windows. "Most everything on the ship is controlled from here, except the operation of deep water equipment. That takes place in compartments containing electronics designed for specialized deep-sea projects. Shannon stared at the gleaming chrome, the colorful images on the monitors, the panoramic view of the sea around the bows. It all seemed as impressive and modern as a futuristic video parlor. "Where is the helm?" she asked. "The old-fashioned wheel went out with the Queen Mary," answered Pitt. He showed her the console for the ship's automated control, a panel with levers and a remote control unit that could be mounted on the bridge wings. Navigation is now carried out by computers. The captain can even con the ship by voice command. For someone who digs up old potsherds, I had no idea ships were so advanced. After lagging as a stepchild for 40 years, marine science and technology have finally been recognized by government and private business as the emerging industry of the future. You never fully explained what you're doing in the waters off Peru. We're probing the seas in search of new drugs, he answered. Drugs? As in take 2 plankton and call me in the morning? Pitt smiled and nodded. It's entirely within the realm of possibility your doctor may someday actually prescribe such a remedy. So the hunt for new drugs has gone underwater. A necessity. We've already found and processed over 90% of all the land organisms that provide sources of medicine to treat diseases. Aspirin and quinine come from the bark of trees. Chemicals contained in everything from snake venom to secretion from frogs to lymph from pigs' glands are used in drug compounds. But marine creatures and the microorganisms that dwell in the depths have been an untapped source, and might well be the hope of curing every affliction, including the common cold, cancer, or AIDS. But surely you can't simply go out and bring back a boatload of microbes for processing at a laboratory for distribution to your friendly pharmacy. Not as far-fetched as you might think, he said. Any one of 100 organisms that live in a drop of water can be cultivated, harvested, and rendered into medicines. Jellyfish, an invertebrate animal called a bryozoan, certain sponges, and several corals are currently being developed into anti-cancer medicines, anti-inflammatory agents for arthritis pain, and drugs that suppress organ rejection after transplant surgery. The test results on a chemical isolated from kelp look especially encouraging in combating a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis. Just where in the ocean are you looking for these wonder drugs? Asked Shannon. This expedition is concentrating on a ridge of chimney-like vents where hot magma from within the Earth's mantle comes in contact with cold seawater and spews through a series of cracks before spreading across the bottom. You might call it a deep ocean hot spring. Various minerals are deposited over a wide area: copper, zinc, iron, along with water heavy in hydrogen sulfide. Incredibly vast colonies of giant clams, mussels, huge tube worms, and bacteria that utilize the sulfur compounds to synthesize sugars live and thrive in this dark and toxic environment. It is this remarkable species of sea life that we're collecting with submersibles for laboratory testing and clinical trials back in the States. Are there many scientists working on these miracle cures? Pitt shook his head. Around the world, maybe 50 or 60. Marine medical research is still in its infancy. How long before we see the drugs on the market? The regulatory obstacles are staggering. Doctors won't be prescribing many of these medications for another 10 years. Shannon walked over to an array of monitors that filled an entire panel of one bulkhead. This looks impressive. Our secondary mission is to map the seafloor wherever the ship sails. What are the monitors showing? You're looking at the bottom of the sea in a myriad of shapes and images, Pitt explained. Our long-range, low-resolution side-scan sonar system can record a swath in three-dimensional color up to 50 kilometers wide. Shannon stared at the incredible display of ravines and mountains thousands of meters below the ship. I never thought I'd be able to observe the land beneath the sea this clearly. It's like staring out the window of an airliner over the Rocky Mountains. With computer enhancement, it becomes even sharper. Romance of the Seven Seas, she waxed philosophically. You're like the early explorers who charted new worlds. Pitt laughed. High tech takes away any hint of the romance. They left the bridge, and he showed her through the ship's laboratory, where a team of chemists and marine biologists were fussing over a dozen glass tanks, teeming with 100 different denizens from the deep, studying data from computer monitors, and examining microorganisms under microscopes. After retrieval from the bottom, said Pitt, this is where the first step in the quest for new drugs begins. What is your part in all of this? Shannon asked. Al Giordino and I operate the robotic vehicles that probe the seafloor for promising organism sites. When we think we've located a prime location, we go down in a submersible to collect the specimens. She sighed. Your field is far more exotic than mine. Pitt shook his head. I disagree. Searching into the origins of our ancestors can be pretty exotic in its own right. If we feel no attraction for the past, why do millions of us pay homage to ancient Egypt, Rome, and Athens every year? Why do we wander over the battlefields of Gettysburg and Waterloo, or stand on the cliffs and look down on the beaches of Normandy? Because we have to look back into history to see ourselves. Shannon stood silently. She had expected a certain coldness from a man whom she had watched kill without apparent remorse. She was surprised at the depth of his words, at his easy way of expressing ideas. He spoke of the sea, of shipwrecks, and of lost treasure. She described the great archaeological mysteries waiting to be solved. There was mutual delight in this exchange, yet there was still an indefinable gap between them. Neither felt strongly attracted to the other. They had strolled out on deck and were leaning over the railing, watching the white foam thrown from the Deep Fathom's bow slide past the hull and merge with the froth from the wake, when skipper Frank Stewart appeared. "It's official," he said in his soft Alabama drawl. "We've been ordered to transport the Peruvian young people and Dr. Kelsey to Lima's port city of Callao." "You were in communication with Admiral Sandecker?" inquired Pitt. Stewart shook his head. "His director of operations, Rudy Gunn. After we set everyone on shore, I assume we sail back on site and continue with the project?" "The crew and I do. You and Al have been ordered to return to the Sacred Well and retrieve Dr. Miller's body." Pitt looked at Stewart as if he were a psychiatrist contemplating a mental case. "Why us? Why not the Peruvian police?" Stewart shrugged. "When I protested that the two of you were vital to the specimen collection operation, Gunn said he was flying in your replacements from Numa's research lab in Key West. That's all he would say." Pitt swung a hand toward the empty helicopter landing pad. "Did you inform Rudy that Al and I are not exactly popular with the local natives and that we're fresh out of aircraft?" "No to the former." Stewart grinned. "Yes to the latter. American embassy officials are making arrangements for you to charter a commercial helicopter in Lima. This makes about as much sense as ordering a peanut butter sandwich in a French restaurant. If you have a complaint, I suggest you take it up with Gunn personally when he meets us on the dock in Callao." Pitt's eyes narrowed. Sandecker's right-hand man flies over 6,500 kilometers from Washington to oversee a body recovery? What gives? "More than meets the eye, obviously," said Stewart. He turned and looked at Shannon. "Gunn also relayed a message to you from a David Gaskill. He said you'd recall the name." She seemed to stare at the deck in thought for a moment. Yes, I remember. He's an undercover agent with the U.S. Customs Service who specializes in the illicit smuggling of antiquities. Stewart continued. Gaskill said to tell you he thinks he's traced the golden bodysuit of Tia Pollo to a private collector in Chicago. Shannon's heart fluttered, and she gripped the handrail until her knuckles turned ivory. Good news? Asked Pitt. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked stunned. Pitt put his arm around her waist to support her. Are you all right? The golden bodysuit of Tia Pollo, she murmured reverently, was lost to the world in a daring robbery at the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Seville in 1922. There isn't an archaeologist alive who wouldn't sign away his or her pension to study it. What exactly makes it so special? Asked Stewart. It is considered the most prized artifact to ever come out of South America because of its historic significance, Shannon lectured, as if entranced. The gold casing covered the mummy of a great Chachapoyan general known as Naimlap, from the toes to the top of the head. The Spanish conquerors discovered Naimlap's tomb in 1547 in a city called Tia Pollo high in the mountains. The event was recorded in 2 early documents, but today Tia Pollo's precise location is unknown. I've only seen old black-and-white photos of the suit, but you could tell that the intricately hammered metalwork was breathtaking. The iconography, the traditional images, and the designs on the exterior were lavishly sophisticated and formed a pictorial record of a legendary event. Picture writing, as in Egyptian hieroglyphics? Asked Pitt. Very similar. What we might call an illustrated comic strip, added Giordino as he stepped out on deck. Shannon laughed. Only without the panels. The panels were never fully deciphered. The obscure references seemed to indicate a long journey by boat to a place somewhere beyond the empire of the Aztecs. For what purpose? Asked Stewart. To hide a vast royal treasure that belonged to Huascar, an Inca king who was captured in battle and murdered by his brother Atahualpa, who was in turn executed by the Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro. Huascar possessed a sacred gold chain that was 214 meters long. One report given to the Spaniards by Incas claimed that 200 men could scarcely lift it. Roughly figuring that each man hoisted 60% of his weight, mused Giordino, you're talking over 9,000 kilograms or 20,000 pounds of gold. Multiply that by 12 troy ounces, and you get 240,000 ounces, Pitt helped out. Giordino's calculating expression suddenly crumbled into blank astonishment. Oh, my God, on today's gold market that works out to well over $100 million. Well, that can't be right, scoffed Stewart. Compute it for yourself, muttered Giordino, still stupefied. Stewart did, and his face went as blank as Giordino's. Mother of heaven, he's right. Shannon nodded. That's just the price of the gold. As an artifact, it is priceless. The Spanish never got their hands on it? Pitt asked Shannon. No, along with a vast hoard of other royal wealth, the chain disappeared. You've probably all heard the story of how Huascar's brother Atahualpa tried to buy his freedom from Pizarro and his conquistadors by offering to fill a room that measured 7 meters in length by 5 meters wide with gold. Atahualpa stood on his tiptoes, reached up and drew a line around the room that was almost 3 meters from the floor, the height to which the gold would top out. Another smaller room nearby was to be filled with silver twice over. Has to be a world's record for ransom, mused Stewart. According to the legend, Shannon continued, Atahualpa seized massive numbers of golden objects from palaces, religious temples, and public buildings. But the supply was coming up short, so he went after his brother's treasures. Huascar's agents warned him of the situation, and he conspired to have his kingdom's treasures spirited away before Atahualpa and Pizarro could get their hands on them. Guarded by loyal Chachapoyan warriors, commanded by General Nimlap, untold tons of gold and silver objects, along with the chain, were secretly transported by a huge human train to the coast, where they were loaded on board a fleet of reed and balsa rafts that sailed toward an unknown destination far to the north. "Is there any factual basis to the story?" Pitt asked. Between the years 1546 and 1568, a Jesuit historian and translator, Bishop Juan de Avila, recorded many mythical accounts of early Peruvian cultures. While attempting to convert the Chachapoyan people to Christianity, he was told 4 different stories about a great treasure belonging to the Inca kingdom that their ancestors helped carry across the sea to an island far beyond the land of the Aztecs, where it was buried. Supposedly it is guarded by a winged jaguar until the day the Incas return and retake their kingdom in Peru. "There must be 100 coastal islands between here and California," said Stewart. Shannon followed Pitt's gaze down to the restless sea. "There is, or I should say was, another source of the legend." "All right," said Pitt, "let's hear it." When the bishop was questioning the Cloud People, as the Chachapoyans were called, one of the tales centered on a jade box containing a detailed chronicle of the voyage. "An animal skin painted with symbolic pictographs?" "No, a quipu," Shannon replied softly. Stewart tilted his head quizzically. "A what?" "Quipu. An Inca system for working out mathematical problems and for record-keeping. Quite ingenious, really. It was a kind of ancient computer using colored strands of string or hemp, with knots placed at different intervals. The various color-coded strands signified different things: blue for religion, red for the king, gray for places and cities, green for people, and so forth. A yellow thread could indicate gold, while a white one referred to silver. The placement of knots signified numbers, such as the passage of time. In the hands of a quipu mayok, a secretary or clerk, the possibilities of creating everything from records of events to warehouse inventories were endless. Unfortunately, most all the quipus, one of the most detailed statistical records of a people's history ever kept, were destroyed during the Spanish conquest and the oppression that followed. Pitt said, "And this stringed instrument, if you'll forgive the pun, was used to give an account of the voyage, including time, distances, and location?" "That was the idea," Shannon agreed. "Any clues as to whatever became of the jade box?" "One story claims the Spaniards found the box with its quipu and, not knowing its value, sent it to Spain. But during shipment aboard a treasure galleon bound for Panama, the box, along with a cargo of precious artifacts and a great treasure of gold and silver, was captured by the English Seahawk, Sir Francis Drake." Pitt turned and regarded her as he might a classic automobile he'd never seen before. "The Chachapoyan treasure map went to England?" Shannon gave a helpless shrug. "Drake never mentioned the jade box or its contents when he reached England after his epic voyage around the world. Since then, the map has become known as the Drake Quipu, but it was never seen again." "A hell of a tale," Pitt muttered quietly. His eyes seemed to turn dreamlike as his mind visualized something beyond the horizon. But the best part is yet to come. Shannon and Stewart both stared at him. Pitt's gaze turned skyward as a seagull circled the ship and then winged toward land. There was a look of utter certainty in his eyes as he faced them again, a crooked smile curving his lips, the wavy strands of his ebony hair restless in the breeze. "Why do you say that?" Shannon asked hesitantly. "Because I'm going to find the jade box." "You're putting us on," Stewart laughed. "Not in the least." The distant expression on Pitt's craggy face had changed to staunch resolve. For a moment, Shannon was stunned. The sudden change from his previous mocking skepticism was totally unexpected. "You sound like you're on the lunatic fringe." Pitt tilted his head back and laughed heartily. "That's the best part about being crazy. You see things nobody else can see." Chapter 12. St. Julien Perlmutter was a classic gourmand and bon vivant. Excessively fond of fine food and drink, he reveled in sociable tastes, possessing an incredible file of recipes from the renowned chefs of the world, and a cellar with more than 4,000 bottles of vintage wine. A host with an admirable reputation for throwing gourmet dinners at elegant restaurants, he paid a heavy price. St. Julien Perlmutter weighed in at close to 181 kilograms, 400 pounds. Scoffing at physical workouts and diet foods, his fondest wish was to enter the great beyond while savoring a 100-year-old brandy after a sumptuous meal. Besides eating, his other burning passion was ships and shipwrecks. He had accumulated what was acknowledged by archival experts as the world's most complete collection of literature and records on historic ships. Maritime museums around the world counted the days until overindulgence did him in, so they could pounce like vultures and absorb the collection into their own libraries. There was a reason Perlmutter always entertained in restaurants instead of at his spacious carriage house in Georgetown, outside the nation's capital. A gigantic mass of books was stacked on the floor, on sagging shelves, and in every nook and cranny of his bedroom, the living and dining rooms, and even in the kitchen cabinets. They were piled head-high beside the commode in his bathroom, and were scattered like chaff on the king-size waterbed. Archival experts would have required a full year to sort out and catalogue the thousands of books stuffed in the carriage house. But not Perlmutter. He knew precisely where any particular volume was stashed, and could pick it out within seconds. He was dressed in his standard uniform of the day, purple pajamas under a red and gold paisley robe, standing in front of a mirror salvaged from a stateroom on the Lusitania, trimming a magnificent gray beard, when his private line gave off a ring like a ship's bell. "St. Julien Perlmutter here. State your business in a brief manner." "Hello, you old derelict." "Dirk!" he boomed, recognizing the voice, his blue eyes twinkling from a round crimson face. "Where's that recipe for apricot sautéed prawns you promised me?" "In an envelope on my desk. I forgot to mail it to you before I left the country. My apologies." "Where are you calling from?" "A ship off the coast of Peru." "I'm afraid to ask what you're doing down there." "A long story." "Aren't they all?" "I need a favor." Perlmutter sighed. "What ship is it this time?" "The Golden Hind." "Francis Drake's Golden Hind?" "The same." "Sic parvis magna," Perlmutter quoted. "Great things have small beginnings. That was Drake's motto. Did you know that?" "Somehow it escaped me," Pitt admitted. "Drake captured a Spanish galleon." "The Nuestra Señora de la Concepción," Perlmutter interrupted. "Captained by Juan de Anton, bound for Panama City from Callao de Lima with a cargo of bullion and precious Inca artifacts. As I recall, it was in March of 1578. There was a moment of silence at the other end of the line. "Why is it when I talk to you, Julian, you always make me feel as if you took away my bicycle?" "I thought you'd like a bit of knowledge to cheer you up," Perlmutter laughed. "What precisely do you wish to know?" "When Drake seized the Concepcion, how did he handle the cargo?" The event was quite well recorded. He loaded the gold and silver bullion, including a hoard of precious gems and pearls, on board the Golden Hind. The amount was enormous. His ship was dangerously overloaded, so he dumped several tons of the silver into the water by Cano Island off the coast of Ecuador before continuing on his voyage around the world. What about the Inca treasures? They were left in the cargo holds of the Concepcion. Drake then put a prize crew on board to sail her back through the Magellan Strait and across the Atlantic to England. Did the galleon reach port? No, answered Perlmutter thoughtfully. It went missing and was presumed lost with all hands. I'm sorry to hear that, said Pitt, disappointment in his voice. I had hopes it might have somehow survived. Come to think of it, recalled Perlmutter, a myth did arise concerning the Concepcion's disappearance. What was the gist of it? A fanciful story, little more than rumor, said the galleon was caught in a tidal wave that carried it far inland. Never verified or documented, of course. Do you have a source for the rumor? Further research will be needed to verify details, but if my memory serves me correctly, the tale came from a mad Englishman the Portuguese reported finding in a village along the Amazon River. Sorry, that's about all I can give you on the spur of the moment. I'd be grateful if you dug a little deeper, said Pitt. I can give you the dimensions and tonnage of the Concepcion, how much sail she carried, when and where she was built. But a crazy person wandering around a rainforest calls for a source outside my collection. If anyone can track down a sea mystery, you can. I have an utter lack of willpower when it comes to delving into one of your enigmas, especially after we found old Abe Lincoln on a Confederate ironclad in the middle of the Sahara Desert together. I leave it to you, Julian. Ironclads in a desert, Noah's Ark on a mountain, Spanish galleons in a jungle. Why don't ships stay on the sea where they belong? That's why you and I are incurable lost shipwreck hunters, said Pitt cheerfully. What's your interest in this one? Perlmutter asked warily. A jade box containing a knotted cord that gives directions to an immense Inca treasure. Perlmutter mulled over Pitt's brief answer for several seconds before he finally said, Well, I guess that's as good a reason as any. Hiram Yeager looked as if he should have been pushing a shopping cart full of shabby belongings down the back alley. He was attired in a Levi's jacket and pants, his long blond hair tied in a loose ponytail, and his boyish face half hidden by a scraggly beard. The only shopping cart Yeager ever pushed, however, was down the delicatessen aisle of a supermarket. A stranger would have been hard-pressed to imagine him living in a fashionable residential area of Maryland with a lovely artist wife and two pretty, smart teenage girls in private school, and driving a top-of-the-line BMW. Nor would someone who didn't know him guess that he was chief of Numa's Communications and Information Network. Admiral Sandecker had pirated him away from a Silicon Valley computer corporation to build a vast data library, containing every book, article, or thesis, scientific or historical, fact or theory, ever known to be written about the sea. What St. Julian Perlmutter's archive was to ships, Yeager's was to oceanography and the growing field of undersea sciences. He was sitting at his own private terminal in a small side office of the computer data complex that took up the entire 10th floor of the Numa building when his phone buzzed. Without taking his eyes from a monitor that showed how ocean currents affected the climate around Australia, he picked up the receiver. "Greetings from the Brain Trust," he answered casually. "You wouldn't know gray matter if it splashed on your shoe," came the voice of an old friend. "Good to hear from you, Mr. Special Projects Director. The office topic of the day says you're enjoying a fun-filled holiday in sunny South America. You heard wrong, pal. Are you calling from the deep fathom? Yes, Al and I are back on board after a little excursion into the jungle. What can I do for you? Delve into your data bank and see if you can find any record of a tidal wave that struck the shoreline between Lima, Peru, and Panama City sometime in March of 1578. Jaeger sighed. Why don't you also ask me to find the temperature and humidity on the day of creation? Just the general area where the wave struck will do, thank you. Any record of such an event would likely be in old weather and maritime records I gleaned from Spanish archives in Seville. Another remote possibility would be the local inhabitants, who might have handed down legends of such an event. The Incas were good at recording social and religious occasions on textiles or pottery. Not a good lead, Pitt said doubtfully. The Inca Empire was smashed by the Spanish conquest nearly 40 years earlier. Whatever records they made in recalling the news of the day were scattered and lost. Most tidal waves that come inland are caused by seafloor movement. Maybe I can piece together known geological events of that era. Give it your best try. How soon do you need it? Unless the Admiral has you on a priority project, drop everything else and go. All right, said Jaeger, eager for the challenge. I'll see what I can come up with. Thanks, Hiram. I owe you. About 100 times over. And don't mention this to Sandecker, said Pitt. I thought it sounded like another one of your shady schemes. Mind telling me what this is all about? I'm looking for a lost Spanish galleon in a jungle. But of course, what else? Jaeger said with routine resignation. He had learned long before never to anticipate Pitt. I'm hoping you can find me a ballpark to search. As a matter of fact, through clean living and moral thinking, I can already narrow your field of search by a wide margin. What do you know that I don't? Jaeger smiled to himself. The lowlands between the west flank of the Andes and the coast of Peru have an average temperature of 18 degrees Celsius, or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and an annual rainfall that would hardly fill a shot glass, making it one of the world's coldest and driest low-altitude deserts. No jungle for a ship to get lost in there. So, what's your hot spot? Asked Pitt. Ecuador. The coastal region is tropical all the way to Panama. A precision display of deductive reasoning. You're okay, Hiram. I don't care what your ex-wives say about you. A mere trifle. I'll have something for you in 24 hours. I'll be in touch. As soon as he put down the phone, Jaeger began assembling his thoughts. He never failed to find the novelty of a shipwreck search stimulating. The areas he planned to investigate were neatly filed in the computer of his mind. During his years with Numa, he had discovered that Dirk Pitt didn't walk through life like other men. Simply working with Pitt and supplying data information had been one long, intrigue-filled, vicarious adventure, and Jaeger took pride in the fact that he had never fumbled the ball that was passed to him.
This book is continued on Disc 5. Disc 5.
Chapter 13. As Pitt was making plans to search for a landlocked Spanish galleon, Adolphus Rummel, a noted collector of South American antiquities, stepped out of the elevator into his plush penthouse apartment 20 floors above Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. A short, stringy man with a shaven head and an enormous walrus mustache, Rummel was in his mid-70s and looked more like a Sherlock Holmes villain than the owner of 6 huge auto salvage yards. Like many of his extremely wealthy peers who compulsively amassed priceless collections of antiquities from the black market with no questions asked, Rummel was unmarried and reclusive. No one was ever allowed to view his pre-Columbian artifacts. Only his accountant and attorney were aware of their existence, but they had no idea of how extensive his inventory was. In the 1950s, German-born Rummel smuggled a cache of Nazi ceremonial objects across the Mexican border. The contraband included presentation daggers and Knight's Cross medals awarded to Germany's greatest World War II heroes, as well as a number of historic documents signed by Adolf Hitler and his maniacal cronies. Selling his hoard to collectors of Nazi artifacts at premium prices, Rummel took the profits and launched an auto junkyard that he built into a scrap metal empire, netting him nearly $250 million over 40 years. After a business trip to Peru in 1974, he developed an interest in ancient South American art and began buying from dealers, honest or criminal. Source did not matter to him. Corruption was as common as rain in a jungle among the brotherhood of artifact finders and sellers throughout Central and South America. Rummel gave no thought to whether his acquired pieces were legally excavated but sold out the back door, or stolen from a museum. They were for his satisfaction and enjoyment, and his alone. He walked past the Italian marble walls of his foyer and approached a large mirror with a thick gilded frame covered with naked cherubs entwined around a continuous grapevine. Twisting the head of a cherub in one corner, Rummel sprang the catch that unlatched the mirror, revealing a concealed doorway. Behind the mirror, a stairway led down into 8 spacious rooms lined with shelves and filled with tables supporting at least 30 glass cases, packed with more than 2,000 ancient pre-Columbian artifacts. Reverently, as if walking down the aisle of a church toward the altar, he moved about the gallery, cherishing the beauty and craftsmanship of his private hoard. It was a ritual he performed every evening before going to bed, almost as if he were a father looking in on his sleeping children. Rummel's pilgrimage finally ended at the side of a large glass case that was the centerpiece of the gallery. It held the crowning treasure of his collection. Gleaming under halogen spotlights, the golden bodysuit of Tiapoyo lay in splendor, arms and legs outstretched, the mask sparkling with emeralds in the eye sockets. The magnificent brilliance of the artistry never failed to move Rummel. Knowing full well it had been stolen from the National Anthropological Museum in Seville, Spain, 76 years previously, Rummel did not hesitate to pay $1,200,000 in cash when he was approached by a group of men who claimed to be connected to the mafia, but were in reality members of a clandestine underground syndicate that specialized in the theft of precious art objects. Where they had come upon the golden suit, Rummel had no idea. He could only assume they had either stolen it themselves or bought it from the collector who had dealt with the original thieves. Having had his nightly gratification, Rummel turned off the lights, returned upstairs to the foyer, and closed the mirror. Moving behind a wet bar designed around a 2,000-year-old Roman sarcophagus, he half-filled a small snifter from a bottle of brandy and retired to his bedroom to read before falling asleep. In another apartment directly level and across the street from Rummel's building, United States Customs Agent David Gaskill sat and peered through a pair of high-powered binoculars mounted on a tripod as the artifacts collector prepared for bed. Another agent might have been bored after nearly a week of stakeout, but not Gaskill. An 18-year veteran of the Gaskill looked like a football coach than a special government agent, a look he cultivated for his work. His gray hair was curly and combed back. An African-American, his skin was more doe-skin brown than dark coffee, and his eyes were a strange mixture of mahogany and green. His massive bulldog head seemed to grow out of his shoulders on a stunted, tree-trunk neck. A huge mountain of a man, he was once an all-star linebacker for the University of Southern California. He had worked hard to lose his South Carolina drawl and spoke with practiced diction, occasionally being mistaken for a former British citizen from the Bahamas. Gaskell had been fascinated by pre-Columbian art ever since a field trip to the Yucatan Peninsula during school. When stationed in Washington, D.C., he had held dozens of investigations involving looted artifacts from the Anasazi and Hohokam cultures of the American Southwest Desert. He was working on a case involving the smuggling of carved Mayan stone panels when he received a tip that was passed along to him by Chicago police from a cleaning woman. She had accidentally discovered photographs protruding from a drawer in Rummel's penthouse of what she believed to be a man's body covered in gold. Thinking that someone might have been murdered, she stole a photo and turned it over to the police. A detective who had worked on art fraud cases recognized the golden object as an antiquity and called Gaskell. Rummel's name had always been high on the Customs Service's list of people who collected ancient art without concern about where it came from, but there was never any evidence of illegal dealings, nor did Gaskell have a clue where Rummel kept his hoard. The special agent, who possessed the expertise of an antiquities scholar, immediately recognized the photo supplied by the cleaning lady as the long-lost golden bodysuit of Tiapoyo. He set up an immediate round-the-clock surveillance of Rummel's penthouse and had the old man tailed from the time he left the building until he returned. But 6 days of tight scrutiny had turned up no indication of where Rummel's collection was hidden. The suspect never varied his routine. After leaving for his office at the lower end of Michigan Avenue, where he'd spend 4 hours sifting through his investments, it was lunch at a rundown cafe where he always ordered bean soup and a salad. The rest of the afternoon was spent prowling antique stores and art galleries. Then dinner at a quiet German restaurant, after which he would take in a movie or a play. He usually arrived home at 11:30. The routine never varied. "Doesn't he ever get tired of drinking the same rot-gut in bed?" muttered Special Agent Winfried Pottle. "Speaking for myself, I'd prefer the waiting arms of a beautiful woman oozing supple elegance and wearing a little something black and flimsy." Gaskell pulled back from the binoculars and made a dour face at his second-in-command of the surveillance team. Unlike Gaskell in his Levi's and USC football jacket, Pottle was a slim, handsome man with sharp features and soft red hair, who dressed in three-piece suits complete with pocket watch and chain. "After seeing a few of the women you date, I'd have to say that was wishful thinking." Pottle nodded at Rummel's penthouse. "At least give me credit for not leading a regimented existence. I shudder to think how you'd behave if you had his money. If I had invested a king's ransom in stolen Indian art, I doubt if I could do as good a job of hiding it." "Rummel has to conceal it somewhere," said Gaskell with a slight trace of discouragement. "His reputation as a buyer of hot goods with a colorful history comes from too many sources in the antiquities market not to be genuine. Makes no sense for a man to build a world-class collection of ancient artifacts and then never go near it. I've yet to hear of a collector, whether he goes in for stamps, coins, or baseball cards, who didn't study and fondle them at every opportunity. Wealthy art junkies who pay big bucks for stolen Rembrandts and Van Goghs are known to sit all alone in hidden vaults, gazing at them for hours on end. I know some of these guys, who started with nothing, got rich, and then lusted to collect objects only they could possess. Many of them abandoned families or gladly suffered divorce because their craving became an obsession. That's why someone as addicted to pre-Columbian art as Rummel could never ignore a hoard that's probably more valuable than any in the finest museums in the world. Did you ever consider the possibility that our sources might be wrong or highly exaggerated? Asked Pottle gloomily. The cleaning lady who claimed she found the photograph of the gold suit is a confirmed alcoholic. Gaskell slowly shook his head. Rummel's got it stashed somewhere, I'm convinced. Pottle stared across at Rummel's apartment as the lights blinked out. If you're right, and if I were Rummel, I'd take it to bed with me. Sure you would. Gaskell stopped abruptly as Pottle's wit triggered a thought. Your perverted mind just made a good point. It did? Muttered a confused Pottle. What rooms do not have windows in the penthouse? The ones we can't observe. Pottle looked down at the carpet in thought for a moment. According to the floor plan, 2 bathrooms, a pantry, the short hall between the master and guest bedrooms, and the closets. We're missing something. Missing what? Rummel seldom remembers to draw his curtains. We can watch 90% of his movements once he steps off the elevator. No way he could store a ton of art treasures in a couple of bathtubs and a closet. True, but where does he spend the 30 or 40 minutes from the time he exits the lobby and steps into the elevator until he sets foot in his living room? Certainly not in the foyer. Maybe he sits on the john. Nobody is that regular. Gaskell stood and walked over to a coffee table and spread out a set of blueprints of Rummel's penthouse obtained from the building's developer. He studied them for what had to be the 50th time. The artifacts have to be in the building. We've checked every apartment from the main floor to the roof, said Pottle. They're all leased by live-in tenants. What about the one directly below Rummel? Asked Gaskell. Pottle thumbed through a sheaf of computer papers. Sidney Kammer and his wife Candy. He's one of those high-level corporate attorneys who saves his clients from paying a bushel of taxes. Gaskell looked at Pottle. When was the last time Kammer and his wife made an appearance? Pottle scanned the log they maintained of residents who entered and left the building during the surveillance. No sign of them. They're no-shows. I bet if we checked it out, the Kammers live in a house somewhere in a plush suburb and never set foot in their apartment. They could be on vacation. The voice of Agent Beverly Swain broke over Gaskell's portable radio. I have a large moving van backing into the basement of the building. Are you manning the front security desk or checking out the basement? Asked Gaskell. Still in the lobby, walking my post in a military manner, Swain answered pertly. A smart little blonde and a California beach girl before joining Customs, she was the best undercover agent Gaskell had on his team and the only one inside Rummel's building. If you think I'm bored with watching TV monitors depicting basements, elevators, and hallways, and on my way out the door for a flight to Tahiti, you're half right. Save your money, replied Pottle. Tahiti is nothing but tall palms and exotic beaches. You can get that in Florida. Run tape on the front entrance, ordered Gaskell. Then trot down to the basement and question the movers. Find out if they're moving someone in or out of the building, what apartment, and why they're working at this ungodly hour. On my way, Swain answered through a yawn. I hope she doesn't meet up with a monster, said Pottle. What monster? Asked Gaskell with raised eyebrows. You know, in all those stupid horror movies, a woman alone in a house hears a strange noise in the cellar. Then she investigates by going down the stairs without turning on the lights or holding a kitchen knife for protection. Typical lousy Hollywood direction. Gaskell shrugged. Not to worry about Bev. The basement is lit like Las Vegas Boulevard, and she's packing a 9mm Colt Combat Commander. Pity the poor monster who comes on to her. Now that Rummel's penthouse was dark, Gaskill took a few minutes away from the binoculars to knock off half a dozen glazed donuts and down a thermos bottle of cold milk. He was sadly contemplating the empty donut box when Swain reported in. "The movers are unloading furniture for an apartment on the 19th floor. They're ticked off at working so late, but are being well paid for overtime. They can't say why the client is in such a rush, only that it must be one of those last-minute corporate transfers. Any possibility they're smuggling artifacts into Rummel's place? They opened the door of the van for me. It's packed with Art Deco-style furniture. Okay, monitor their movements every few minutes." Pottle scribbled on a notepad and hung up a wall phone in the kitchen. When he returned to Gaskill's position at the window, he had a cagey grin on his face. "I bow to your intuition. Sit